Hi guys, tonight we wander into candlelit Rome, through the hushed corridors of the Lateran Palace, where shadows cling to frescoed walls and secrets cling even tighter to the men who wore the papal tiara. You step softly across marble floors polished by centuries of bare feet, incense smoke curling in your nose, and you realize this is not the church you imagined from Sunday school. Behind the gilded altars, whispers rise of power plays, feasts that blur into orgies, and family dynasties stitched together by lies. And just between us, you probably won't survive this tour of papal scandals with your innocence intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it by your clock right now? Now, dim the lights, because the story begins with the Lateran itself, the heart of medieval papal life, and a palace more notorious for its excess than any holy silence. You walk past guards, half asleep with their spears leaning against stone. Their armor rattles, the sound metallic and sour in this place that is supposed to echo only prayers. Instead, you hear a different music: laughter, muffled moans, and the unmistakable shuffle of dice on a wooden table tucked somewhere behind velvet curtains. The Lateran Palace was the true papal residence for centuries before the Vatican became dominant. Its reputation grew not only as a spiritual center but as a theater of political deals. The mainstream fact is that the palace housed councils that defined doctrine and bound kings to papal will. Yet your eyes catch something more human, the faint outline of a tapestry hiding a passageway, one that doesn't lead to chapels but to bedrooms where servants gossip that the Pope's nephews sleep. Historians still wonder whether those nephews were really sons, cloaked by euphemism and silence. The smell of roasted boar drifts through the corridors. Kitchens blaze with fires, pots simmering with spiced stews, and platters ready to feed not just clerics but ambassadors, mercenaries, and mistresses alike. The irony presses in. You hear monks chanting about fasting, while silver goblets brim with imported wine. A quirky tidbit survives in Chronicles. One pope's cooks prepared eel pies so often that ambassadors joked Rome's river was emptied for his table. You almost laugh, then pause, realizing the joke probably hid a sting of truth. And it's not only food that overwhelms you, it's the politics of flesh. You pass painted chambers, walls glowing with saints' halos, but in the corners servants whisper about noblewomen invited for confessions that stretched until dawn. The palace creaks with contradictions. Outside, the faithful kneel in dust, begging for blessings. Inside, carpets imported from the East cushion the feet of men who vow poverty, yet never go hungry. You turn a corner and hear raised voices, cardinals arguing. The air is thick with smoke from torches and anger. The issue at stake isn't salvation but power. Who controls which bishopric? Who secures which alliance? Who gets the bribe offered in Venetian ducats? Simony is not an isolated sin, whispered later in councils. It's right here in front of you. Raw and almost casual. Coins click like prayer beads in greedy fingers. You realize the Lateran wasn't just a palace. It was a marketplace where faith became currency. And then there's the darker humor of history. Chroniclers write about animals prowling the halls, monkeys and exotic pets gifted by ambassadors, roaming freely while clerics argued theology. Imagine the sight. A pope scolding his cardinals while a parrot shrieks obscenities it learned from soldiers in the courtyard. Scholars debate whether those accounts were satirical exaggerations or bitter truths penned by reformers. But the image lingers. You almost smile, then shiver, realizing satire often survives because it carries a kernel of reality. The Lateran at night presses on your senses like a fever dream. Torches flare, the walls flicker, and every shadow seems alive. You run your hand along the cold stone, smooth where thousands of hands have touched, and wonder how many secrets the walls could tell if they spoke. You hear the distant toll of bells calling to prayer, but the echo blends with the clatter of a lute string and a woman's laugh. This is not silence. This is theatre. And so, tonight, You stand in the moonlit corridors of the Lateran, at the threshold of a saga where popes were not only shepherds of souls but emperors of appetite, where power tasted like roasted boar and smelled like incense covering sweat, where the line between prayer and sin blurred into smoke. You're only beginning to step into this labyrinth, and each corridor will lead you deeper into scandals so brazen that even centuries later they make you raise an eyebrow under the dim light. You wander deeper into the labyrinth, the stones under your feet cool as if they have absorbed centuries of sighs and betrayals. Tonight, your path leads you to one of the most human, and perhaps the most scandalous, of papal indulgences, the mistress. For all the rhetoric about chastity and vows of celibacy, the papal court was a stage where whispered romances were as common as whispered prayers. And you, drifting silently down this corridor of history, begin to realize that behind every papal robe there might have been a hidden heart, or at least a wandering desire. The mainstream fact, firmly rooted in the records, is that several popes openly kept women as companions, sometimes even acknowledging them publicly with titles and estates. The paradox is dizzying. These were the men who enforced strict moral codes on priests, demanding purity, while they themselves lounged in silken sheets with partners whose names still stain the pages of history. Take Pope Alexander VI, for instance, whose liaison with Vanozza de Catanei and later with the infamous Giulia Farnese became the gossip not just of Rome but of all Europe. You can almost see him now, seated in a high-backed chair, rings glittering, smiling slyly as Giulia, radiant and far too young for him, leans close. The scent of roses clings to your imagination. Chroniclers noted that the papal apartments smelled not of incense but of imported perfumes, heavy and musky, trailing after women slipping through private doors at twilight. A quirky tidbit survives. Giulia Farnese was so beautiful that Romans nicknamed her the Bride of Christ, a title meant half as blasphemy and half as awe. You pause at that phrase, hearing how irony can echo across centuries. Imagine it a city so accustomed to papal mistresses that their names became parables in taverns. Your ears catch faint music, lutes strumming, flutes winding a lazy melody. The atmosphere is thick with velvet, with candlelight flickering against frescoed ceilings. A feast winds down in your mind's eye, bishops full of wine, laughing too loudly, their laughter hollow. And somewhere beyond the laughter, you hear the softer giggle of women whose presence is officially denied, yet plainly acknowledged by every servant in the palace. Historians still debate whether these liaisons weakened the church, or paradoxically strengthened its image as a worldly power. Was a pope with a mistress seen as a hypocrite, or simply as a prince of Rome behaving like all other nobles? Some scholars argue that keeping mistresses was part of the political theatre alliances cemented by intimacy, favours granted through passion, and dynasties extended through illegitimate children. Others suggest it scandalized the faithful, fueling dissent that would one day erupt into the Reformation. You picture a papal mistress in her chamber, brushing her hair before a polished bronze mirror. Her fingers trace strands scented with oil, and she hums a lullaby from her childhood. Outside her door, guards shift their weight, pretending not to notice the late-night visits. Inside, she is no longer just a lover, she is a strategist. Perhaps she whispers names into the Pope's ear, advising who deserves promotion, who should be exiled. Power passes not only through decrees and councils, but also through pillows and locked rooms. Your steps carry you through an imagined gallery of portraits. Some are vivid, Vanozza, strong and sharp, managing the Borgia children while her papal lover plotted empires. Others blur, names lost in chronicles but remembered in rumours. These women, often painted as temptresses, were also survivors. They navigated a world where the Church's official line condemned them, yet its highest leader welcomed them into his embrace. You feel the contradiction tightening like a knot. You almost sympathize, almost shake your head at the absurdity. And it wasn't always discreet. Some popes fathered children so openly that Rome joked about papal heirs. The official story might call them nephews, but everyone knew better. You can almost hear the street vendors mocking in song, weaving satire into market cries. Fresh figs, fresh bread, blessings from the Pope's son. Quirky, cutting, impossible to ignore. The atmosphere thickens as you move into a courtyard under a starlit sky. Imagine standing in that very place centuries ago, where servants carried torches and women in silk gowns stepped daintily across the stones. Their laughter echoed against marble, carried up to windows where stern-faced clerics frowned and perhaps secretly envied. The juxtaposition is dizzying, prayers rising from chapels, desire rising from bedrooms, both lifting into the same Roman night. And then, darker whispers, rumours that some mistresses weren't only lovers but pawns. Political enemies suggested that certain women were planted by rival families, spies in silk, using intimacy to gain secrets. Could it be true? You tilt your head, listening to the scholars quarrel. Some insist the evidence is thin, others point to intercepted letters, to patterns of promotions that make too much sense to be coincidence. The truth lies somewhere between scandal and strategy, wrapped in layers of rumour and reality. You pause to rest in this vision, leaning against a stone column cool beneath your hand. You imagine the weight of secrecy pressing down on the Pope himself. Outwardly, he raised the host, offered blessings, thundered against sin. Inwardly, he weighed the risks of desire against the thrill of human connection. You can almost feel his pulse racing when footsteps approached, fearing discovery, yet unwilling to give up the warmth that broke his solitude. The human element is undeniable. One chronicler wrote, half in disgust and half in fascination, that the papal court glowed with the brightness of women's eyes more than the holiness of saints' relics. You smile faintly at that, because it feels truer than any dusty doctrine. You sense how the presence of mistresses blurred the line between sacred and profane, until the papacy itself became a theatre of contradictions. And as you leave this corridor behind, your thoughts linger on those women. History often reduced them to shadows, names attached to gossip, but they shaped the papal story as much as the men did. Their perfume lingered in council chambers, their laughter bent the course of politics, and their very existence carved a permanent scandal into the heart of the medieval church. You carry their echo with you, their presence woven into the incense of memory, as you drift further into the labyrinth of papal secrets. The night feels thicker now, the stars above Rome blurred by smoke. You breathe deeply, and the scent is not roses anymore, but the faint bitterness of regret. The mistress scandal was never just about pleasure. It was about power, hypocrisy, and the unquenchable human hunger for closeness even in the shadow of God. And you, silent traveller, can almost feel the contradiction burning on your tongue. You follow the sound of clinking goblets and low laughter, and the trail leads you into another chamber of contradiction, the papal banquet. Here, the promise of poverty is smothered beneath platters of roasted meat, gilded dishes, and fountains that seem to pour more wine than water. The air is so thick with aromas, cinnamon, cloves, garlic, and honey that you almost cough. This isn't just a meal, it's theatre, and the papacy in the Middle Ages knew how to perform. The mainstream fact is undeniable. Popes were supposed to embody Christian humility, yet medieval sources describe their banquets as rivaling the feasts of emperors. Chronicles detail long tables laid with exotic foods imported from as far as the Levant, while musicians played, jugglers entertained, and ambassadors gawked at the wealth Rome could muster. As you step through the archway in your imagination, you see the scene vividly. Rows of bishops shifting uncomfortably in robes as gold platters are set down before them. The clash between ascetic teachings and indulgent practice so sharp you can almost hear it. At the head of the table sits the Pope, smiling faintly, lifting his cup high. His eyes sparkle under candlelight, though the shadows tell you he is weary from the very spectacle he commands. Around him servants scurry, their shoes soft against the marble. The room hums with competing noises, spoons scraping plates, minstrels strumming, courtiers whispering. You let the sound wash over you, realizing this was a form of diplomacy. A lavish banquet impressed kings and envoys, made Rome appear eternal, unshakable, blessed with God's bounty. Yet at the same time, the common faithful starved outside the palace walls. A quirky tidbit bubbles up from one chronicle. Pope Martin IV, it was said, adored eels stewed in wine, so much that he consumed them constantly until, ironically, he died of indigestion from his beloved dish. You can't help but chuckle softly at the image, a pontiff who preached restraint but couldn't resist slippery eels until they undid him. The humor is dark, yet it's a humanizing detail, reminding you that these men who bore God's authority also had the same weaknesses as any diner with too much on his plate. The smells grow stronger in your imagination. Roasted boar with crackling skin, venison dripping with sauce, almond pastries dusted with sugar so fine it gleamed like snow. The servants ladle steaming stews into golden bowls, the scent of saffron wafting up. For a moment you close your eyes, and it is almost overwhelming, the clash of spices, the sweet stickiness of honey-glazed figs, the sour tang of strong wine. You're not just watching a feast, you're breathing it in, and the richness threatens to choke you. Historians still argue whether such opulence was exaggerated by enemies of the papacy, or whether the records are accurate depictions of everyday life at court. Reformist writers had a clear motive to scandalize, but archaeological finds and household accounts confirm the import of vast quantities of luxury goods into Rome. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps not every night was a feast, but when feasts occurred, they were spectacles meant to dazzle and intimidate. You imagine the envoys from France or Germany, their jaws tightening as they realized the Pope's table rivaled their monarch's, his wealth radiating as much power as his spiritual office. But banquets were not only about indulgence, they were about subtle politics. Who sat near the Pope? Who was offered the choicest cuts of meat? Who was left waiting for a dish of scraps? Every bite became a symbol, every pour of wine, a gesture of favor or insult. In this hall, the balance of Christendom could shift with the tilt of a ladle, and in your sleepy walk through history, you sense the tension under the laughter, the daggers of ambition hidden behind polite smiles. You catch the sound of a lute playing a lilting melody, and the notes float above the clatter of knives. A servant drops a goblet, and the clang echoes across the chamber, silencing the room for a heartbeat. Then laughter resumes, forced and sharp. You almost feel the nervous sweat on that servant's brow, the knowledge that one mistake in such a setting could mean exile or worse. The papal court's feast spilled beyond food into spectacle. Accounts mention fountains flowing with wine, entertainers performing bawdy routines, and even animals brought in for display. One traveller recorded a banquet where a tame leopard padded through the hall, chained but still menacing, while diners clapped nervously. Was it allegory or reality? Scholars disagree, but you smile at the absurdity, picturing cardinals clutching their robes as a leopard brushed past their ankles. As the night stretches on, you notice the gradual descent into excess. Bishops loosen their collars, ambassadors flush from too much drink, and laughter grows too loud, too raw. The Pope raises his hand, a gesture meant to bless, but the timing feels more like a host quieting unruly guests. The irony cuts deep. You realize this sacred office had become, in moments like these, a master of ceremonies presiding over indulgence. Step back now, into the courtyard beyond the banquet hall. The night air is cooler, and the smell of roasting meat is replaced by the earthy scent of damp stone. You hear the distant rumble of Rome itself, carts creaking, beggars murmuring prayers, dogs barking in the alleys. Out here, hunger gnaws at the city. Inside, bellies burst with too much food. The contrast is enough to make you dizzy. You glance back at the glowing windows of the hall and wonder, did the Pope himself ever feel that dissonance? Did he ever pause mid-bite and think of the barefoot children in the streets? Some might have, others likely didn't care. Human nature is complicated, even beneath a tiara. That tension between genuine belief and indulgent practice is what fueled satire across Europe. Mocking poems compared popes to gluttonous pigs. Woodcuts depicted the papal court as a trough. And yet the feasts went on, night after night, because appearances of wealth were themselves a tool of survival. The banquet slowly fades in your mind, like a dream slipping away at dawn. You're left with fragments, the gleam of wine on marble, the sticky sweetness of honey on lips, the hollow echo of laughter that sounds more like desperation than joy. You carry with you the unsettling realization that these moments of indulgence weren't just private scandals, they were part of the machinery that kept the papacy in power, feeding not only the stomach but the illusion of eternal Rome. And so you drift onward, the scent of cinnamon still faint in your nose, the echo of goblets still ringing in your ears. You wonder if, in the silence of his chamber afterward, the Pope lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his own heartbeat, and wondering if God approved of eel pies and leopard shows. The answer, of course, remains as hazy as the torch smoke that curled in those banqueting halls. The banquet echoes fade behind you, but the murmur of voices grows louder down the corridor. You find yourself stepping into a chamber not of feasting but of bloodlines, where family ambition clung to the papal throne like ivy on ancient stone. Tonight you see nepotism in its medieval glory, where the shepherd of souls turned into the architect of dynasties. One well-recorded episode reminds you how blatant this practice became. Popes openly promoted their own kin, dressing nephews in scarlet hats, granting bishoprics to cousins, even elevating barely literate teenagers, simply because they shared a surname. You picture the young faces, boys who should have been apprentices in a guild or novices in a monastery suddenly robed in crimson, seated in councils with voices that still cracked. The air must have smelled of beeswax candles and fresh parchment, yet beneath it lingered the pungent odor of raw ambition. You glance toward one of the most notorious examples, Pope Sixtus IV, who turned the College of Cardinals into something like a family reunion. In your imagination, you watch him raise his hand to bless his nephew Girolamo Riario, or dote on another relative elevated far beyond merit. The papal court buzzed with whispers, and enemies muttered that Rome had become less of a holy city and more of a family estate. An odd little anecdote makes the point sharper. Chronicles recall that Sixtus once defended his nepotism by joking that he preferred the devil he knew his nephews over the devils he didn't. Whether he truly said it, or whether enemies put the words in his mouth, the sting remains. You almost smile at the brazen honesty, then shake your head at the absurdity. And yet the practice was not new. You imagine earlier popes striding through these same halls, their robes brushing the stone, planning marriages for nieces, appointing brothers to lucrative sees, and carving out spheres of influence as if they were kings. The official rhetoric might praise humility, but the reality was more like chess played with souls. Step deeper into the chamber of memory, and you hear pens scratching on parchment. Bulls and decrees flow forth, written not in the spirit of scripture, but in the ink of obligation to kin. Imagine the atmosphere, a blend of solemn chants and the rustle of silk, as cardinals bowed to relatives barely fit for the role. Interpretations vary on whether nepotism was entirely destructive. Some historians suggest it stabilized the papacy by surrounding the Pope with loyal allies who would protect his interests. Others argue it hollowed out the church, replacing spiritual leaders with boys more interested in hunting or gambling than in theology. Both images seem to shimmer in torchlight, flickering like shadows that cannot be pinned down. Your steps carry you into a private courtyard, moonlight casting pale silver across carved fountains. Here, in your mind's eye, you see nephews boasting, laughing loudly, their jeweled hands gesturing with authority they scarcely understood. Servants hurry with trays of candied fruit, and the air is heavy with pride. You can almost hear the envy of other noble families, locked out of power while one clan rose on papal shoulders. One curious memory recorded in satire tells of a teenage cardinal nephew so unfamiliar with church ritual that during Mass he confused the chalice for a drinking cup. Whether fact or exaggeration, the tale captures the contempt many felt. Sacred offices reduced to props in a family drama. The deeper you listen, the more tension you sense. Nepotism didn't simply provoke quiet annoyance, it sparked conspiracies. Rival families plotted assassinations, forged alliances, and sometimes waged open war against papal relatives. The smell of roses in palace gardens mixed uneasily with the stench of blood spilled in Roman streets, all because uncles in tiaras wanted to secure their family's legacy. In the midst of this, you wonder, did the popes themselves feel shame? Perhaps some justified it as survival. Others convinced themselves that family loyalty and church stability were the same thing. Yet you imagine a few lying awake, hearing the distant cries of the city, questioning whether their spiritual duty had been traded too cheaply for the laughter of nephews around a supper table. The human detail lingers, the rustle of youthful laughter echoing in chapels, the sight of barely grown men wearing rings heavy with gems, their fingers too thin to carry such weight. These nephews strutted through Rome, their cloaks sweeping dust, while common priests muttered prayers in poverty. You sense the bitterness, the simmering resentment that would not be forgotten. And so nepotism, more than just a practice, became a symbol. It told Europe that the papacy was a family business, its keys not just to heaven but to property and inheritance. It made reformers sneer, poets sharpen their pens, and enemies of Rome find easy targets. Yet, strangely, it also wove the papacy tighter into the web of Italian politics, giving it allies who would bleed for its honor. You stand in that moonlit courtyard, watching shadows of cardinals' hats bob across the stones, and realize this was no minor flaw. It was the heartbeat of a system where sacred trust was fused with private ambition. The night feels heavier as you step away, carrying with you the echo of nephews' laughter and the rustle of silk over stone. Nepotism, in the end, wasn't just about family, it was about the very soul of the papacy, stretched thin between God and bloodline. And you, drifting further into the labyrinth, sense that each step will reveal new contradictions, each darker than the last. The moonlight dims as you step into another shadowed corridor, where the very air feels dangerous. Tonight you linger at the edge of a long table in a smoky chamber, watching a goblet being lifted by trembling hands. The cup gleams faintly, the wine inside darker than blood, and a whisper ripples through the court. Was the Pope poisoned? The papacy in the Middle Ages was never only about prayer. It was about power, and power often ended with daggers or powders hidden in chalices. One detail preserved in contemporary chronicles makes the pattern chillingly clear. More than a few popes died suddenly, their health collapsing in hours, their faces paling as if the breath of God had been snatched away. And while natural illness was always possible, the timing of these deaths, convenient for rivals, never failed to spark suspicion. Imagine the scene, a banquet winding down, the hall heavy with the smell of roasted meats and spiced wine. The Pope raises his cup to his lips, smiling faintly at his gathered cardinals. The chatter dies down. Moments later he coughs, clutching his chest, his eyes bulging in shock. Servants rush forward, dishes clatter, and the hall erupts in chaos. Outside, Rome stirs with rumors before dawn breaks. A curious report survives about Pope Clement II in the 11th century. His reign was brief, barely a year, before he died under circumstances so sudden that many suspected poison. Centuries later, scientists who tested his remains confirmed unusually high levels of lead. Was it a deliberate assassination? Or had the medicines of the time, laden with toxic metals, slowly killed him? Even modern scholars disagree, their arguments echoing like ghostly voices across the centuries. And Clement wasn't alone. Step further, and you encounter Pope Adrian III, collapsing mysteriously during a journey north. Or John the 21, who died when a ceiling fell on him, though some whispered the accident was no accident at all. Each case fueled the same pattern of suspicion. In the papacy, sudden death rarely seemed natural. You pause in the corner of the smoky chamber and take in the sensory details. The flicker of torchlight paints faces with nervous shadows. The sharp, metallic tang of wine fills your nostrils, yet beneath it lingers a hint of bitterness, the kind that comes from herbs ground too finely to detect. You imagine the assassin slipping the powder into the chalice, his heart racing, praying not to be caught. A lighter, stranger story floats from the records. A rumor that one pope feared poisoning so much that he trained his personal taster, a loyal parrot. Supposedly, the bird was fed crumbs soaked in wine before the pope dared to sip. Whether true or exaggerated satire, the image makes you chuckle despite the darkness. A brightly plumed guardian squawking in Latin while servants waited to see if it keeled over. The deeper irony is that the popes themselves were not innocent of such methods. Politics in Rome was tangled, and the papacy wielded poison as often as it feared it. Chronicles accuse certain pontiffs of arranging accidents for rivals. A vial slipped into a banquet, a draught of water altered during confession. Rome became a city where even holy water might taste suspicious. Scholars remain divided on how widespread papal poisoning truly was. Some argue it was exaggerated by enemies, eager to blacken the church's name. Others believe it was practically an institution, as common as dueling among nobles. The evidence is fragmentary, yet the consistency of rumors suggests something more than idle gossip. You walk slowly along a dark hallway now. The flagstones cool beneath your steps. Imagine being a cardinal in that age, knowing each sip could be your last. Would you trust the servant offering you a goblet? Would you breathe easier only when the Pope himself drank first? The paranoia must have been suffocating, a constant perfume of fear hanging in the air. And beyond fear was spectacle. When a pope died suddenly, the city erupted in confusion. Bells tolled, black cloth hung from balconies, and yet in the streets, laughter mingled with mourning. "Which family will win now?" people whispered, as if the death of a pontiff were less a tragedy than a change of season. The papacy, for all its claims of eternity, seemed fragile, undone by powders and plots. Step into one imagined death chamber. The Pope lies on a massive bed, his face waxy, his lips blue. Around him cardinals kneel, some with genuine grief, others already scheming. You can hear their whispers who will be chosen next, what family will rise, which bribes will shift the college's votes. The Pope's body is still warm, but ambition is colder, sharper, already at work. One peculiar note lingers from the chronicle of Benedict XI, who died after only 8 months as Pope. Some claimed he ate poisoned figs, a gift too tempting to refuse. The rumor struck Rome like lightning fruit as the instrument of death, sweet on the tongue, fatal in the gut. You can almost taste it, the soft flesh bursting, the sweetness turning sour as pain knotted his stomach. Whether true or not, the story stuck, and fig sellers in Rome were mocked for years afterward. As you wander further into the labyrinth of memory, the image of poisoned chalices becomes a symbol. It tells you that the papacy was not only a throne of prayer but a seat constantly under siege. Poison reduced the Pope to what he truly was, a man as vulnerable as any other, despite his gilded robes. The chalice that should have held salvation became, in whispers, a tool of damnation. The echo of goblets clinking fades into silence. You stand alone in a cold corridor, the shadows deeper now, the air heavy with dust. The stories of poison swirl around you, half-truths and full terrors, reminding you that in medieval Rome, power was always balanced on the edge of a blade or dissolved in a cup of wine. You step onward, leaving behind the taste of bitterness, the smell of lead and herbs, and the shiver of sudden death. Ahead, you sense other scandals waiting, each as intoxicating and deadly as the poisoned chalice itself. You drift from the memory of poisoned goblets into another chamber where the smoke is thicker, not with incense, but with the smell of wax and coin. The torches sputter as though reluctant to illuminate what unfolds here. The trade in sacred offices, a practice known as simony. The very word comes from Simon Magus, the magician in Scripture who tried to buy spiritual power, and in medieval Rome, his shadow never stopped stretching. The records from the 11th and 12th centuries leave little doubt. Papal elections and appointments often turned into bidding wars. Chronicles tell of cardinals leaving conclaves with their purses bulging, their silence purchased as readily as their votes. The paradox is glaring. These were men entrusted with shepherding Christ's flock, yet their voices in the halls of the Lateran sounded more like auctioneers than apostles. Close your eyes and hear it. A candlelit chamber, the smell of damp stone, parchment laid out on a desk. Whispers thicken like smoke. This bishopric for 300 florins. That abbacy for twice as much. The rustle of coin purses blends with the scrape of quills. Someone coughs. Someone laughs nervously, and you sense the whole room leaning toward corruption as if drawn by gravity. A curious footnote in the Chronicles mentions Pope Benedict IX, whose life reads more like a scandal sheet than a saint's biography. He became pope while still a teenager, was driven from office, returned again, and eventually sold the papacy itself to his godfather. Imagine the scene. The tiara passed across the table like a pawned jewel, the air sharp with the sound of coins being counted. A pope resigning not from shame, but because he had found a buyer. The atmosphere of these smoky rooms was electric with secrecy. You picture a bishop waiting in the shadows, clutching a pouch of gold, his palms sweating. The coins clink softly as he hands them over, his eyes darting to the door. Outside, the faithful kneel in prayer, oblivious that their shepherd's crook was bought like livestock in a market. Some scholars remain divided about how widespread simony was. Reformers of the period painted it as nearly universal, while others argue that such accounts were exaggerated to justify sweeping reforms like those of Gregory VII. The truth may sit in the uneasy middle. Not every appointment was purchased, but enough were to poison the reputation of the papacy for centuries. The sensory detail is undeniable. Imagine the chill of those rooms, the candle wax dripping in slow rivulets, the cloying smell of ink. You run your hand along the rough wood of the table, scarred with scratches from hasty quills. The voices are hushed but urgent, deals struck before dawn breaks. The tension hums in the air, the weight of secrecy pressing against your ears. One anecdote lingers with bitter humor. A cleric, angered that his bribe had not secured him a promotion, is said to have demanded his gold back. When the cardinal refused, the man threatened to sue an absurdity in a system already so far from holy intent. The story may have been exaggerated, but you can almost hear the laughter in taverns. Even salvation has a return policy in Rome. And the consequences? Each bribe chipped away at the papacy's authority. Priests in rural villages grumbled that their bishops cared more for coin than confession. Pilgrims muttered prayers with half-hearted voices, their faith tainted by rumors. The practice of simony fed the growing call for reform, a cry that would eventually swell into thunder in the age of Luther. Step into a courtyard now, the cool night air, a relief after the suffocating smoke. You hear the clink of coins even here, the echo of deals made in shadows. The stars above Rome seem dimmer, veiled by corruption rising like mist. You breathe deeply, but the air tastes of iron, of greed that cannot be washed away. And yet, for the papacy, simony was survival. Popes needed allies, armies, and money. Selling offices provided resources when honest tithes could not. Some popes may have even justified it as practical, choosing to see it not as sin, but as a necessary evil. Did they sleep easier with such reasoning? Or did the sound of clinking coins haunt their dreams? You can almost hear it now, the relentless counting, louder than prayers, filling the silence of their chambers. The scandal of simony stands as a mirror. It shows you not only the corruption of individuals, but the fragility of institutions when pressed by hunger for power. It whispers that even the holiest offices can be bought if the price is right. And it leaves you walking further into the labyrinth with the echo of coins still rattling in your ears, each step heavier with the weight of secrets. The sound of coins fades, but another rhythm rises in its place, the hush of slippers across marble, the rustle of silk skirts brushing against carved columns. You slip into a century, that later writers dared to call the pornocracy an age when popes seemed less like shepherds and more like pawns in the hands of powerful Roman women. The Lateran glows faintly in torchlight, yet the true stage of power lies in the private chambers, where curtains close and whispers decide the fate of Christendom. Contemporary chroniclers left no doubt that Rome in the 10th century was dominated by noble families, and in particular by women of the Tusculan and Theophylact clans. These women, Theodora and her daughter Marozia, loomed over the papacy with a presence both magnetic and scandalous. The mainstream fact is simple enough. They controlled appointments, secured lovers, and maneuvered their sons and grandsons onto the papal throne. The irony presses in like damp air. Holy Rome ruled not by popes but by mistresses and matrons. You picture Marozia walking through the Lateran courtyard, the moon casting silver light on her jeweled gown. Servants bow low, guards avert their eyes, for everyone knows she commands more power than the man in the papal chair. The air smells of roses mixed with sweat, an intoxicating perfume of luxury and control. Behind her, whispers slither like snakes. She is the true pope. A curious anecdote from later satirists paints the scene with biting humor. They claimed Marozia once referred to the pope as her pet, a man dressed in robes of office, but entirely subject to her will. Whether she truly uttered those words remains uncertain, but the image lingers, the Bishop of Rome reduced to a figurehead, while his lover or patroness pulled the strings. You can almost hear the laughter in taverns, coarse and cruel, mocking a church that thundered against female temptation yet bowed beneath it. Step inside one of those imagined chambers. The lamps burn low, the walls hung with crimson drapery. The Pope himself sits at the edge of a bed, his crown set aside on a table, his face flushed with wine. Marozia reclines nearby, her voice soft but sharp, instructing him whom to appoint, which decree to sign. The scent of spiced wine mingles with her perfume. You sense the tension in the air. Power dressed as intimacy, politics disguised as passion. Historians continue to clash over how far these women's influence extended. Some argue that the chronicles exaggerated, painting Marozia as a temptress to explain male weakness. Others insist her dominance was real, pointing to the clear trail of popes from her family line. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle, women of extraordinary intelligence and ambition, operating in a system unprepared to admit their power. Either way, the papacy's image was forever stained by this century of scandal. The atmosphere of Rome itself reflects the chaos. Outside the Lateran, the streets are noisy with vendors, prostitutes, soldiers. The city smells of sweat, wine, and garbage. Inside the palace, silk rustles, jewels glitter, and gossip flows faster than holy water. You close your eyes and listen. The sound of laughter, the creak of a bed, the scrape of a quill, as yet another bull is signed under the influence of a mistress's whisper. An offbeat tale persists of Pope John X, who rose to the throne thanks to Theodora's favor. Some sources claim he was her lover, elevated not by piety, but by passion. His reign ended violently, with imprisonment and death, supposedly orchestrated by Marozia when their alliance soured. You can almost feel the chill of the dungeon where he languished, the damp stone walls echoing his prayers unanswered. Whether he was truly her paramour or simply her pawn, the line between rumor and reality blurs, leaving only scandal in its wake. And yet, despite the corruption, you sense resilience. Even as the papacy was mocked as a plaything of noble women, the institution endured. Councils were held, decrees were issued, masses were sung. Faithful pilgrims still flocked to Rome, clutching relics, whispering prayers, seeking salvation. The paradox is almost unbearable, holiness surviving in a city steeped in intrigue. The satire of the age paints vivid pictures. Poets compared the papacy to a puppet show, the strings pulled not by God, but by women in jeweled gowns. One lampoon imagined the papal tiara as a bridal crown, passed from pope to pope like a wedding token. You smile wryly at the image. The humor, sharp but strangely comforting it, shows how, even in the darkest scandals, laughter found its place. You walk out into a balcony overlooking the city. The night is heavy, stars blurred by smoke. Rome stretches below, a jumble of rooftops, alleys and churches. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, slow and mournful. Yet here in the palace, laughter still rings, soft and sly. You feel the contradiction pressing against your chest, the city of saints echoing with the sins of its shepherds. Marozia's story does not end in triumph. Eventually she too fell, imprisoned by rivals, her power crumbling. But the memory of her rule lingers like perfume in faded velvet, haunting the papacy for centuries. She became legend, her name synonymous with scandal. And you, silent traveller, carry her echo with you now, her jeweled shadow brushing your sleeve as you step deeper into the labyrinth of papal secrets. The pornocracy was more than gossip. It was a revelation that the papacy could be ruled not by divine will but by human desire, and that Rome's throne was vulnerable to anyone clever enough to seize it. That knowledge lingers in your mind like a bitter aftertaste, even as you drift onward, leaving behind the rustle of silk and the faint scent of roses mixed with smoke. The rustle of Marozia's gown fades into silence, and you find yourself standing in a quieter, colder corridor. Here the air tastes of damp stone and dust, heavy with secrets kept behind monastery walls. Tonight you witness one of the papacy's most uncomfortable scandals: illegitimate children fathered by men who vowed celibacy. These sons and daughters were not always whispered away in shame. Sometimes they were pampered, groomed for power, or hidden behind cloisters. Their existence, an open secret in a church that thundered against sin yet could not resist the tug of flesh. One detail firmly attested in records is the brazen acknowledgement of papal offspring. Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, didn't merely father children, he flaunted them. His son Cesare became a cardinal at 18, while another, Juan, strutted around Rome as a duke with papal favour shielding him from consequence. The contradiction is dizzying. You imagine Alexander smiling proudly at his brood, his hand resting on Cesare's shoulder, while priests in the background murmured prayers about chastity. The incense rising in chapels could not mask the odour of hypocrisy. Step closer, and you hear the laughter of children echoing down stone corridors, the patter of small feet against marble. Imagine the papal apartments not only filled with cardinals debating theology, but also with boys chasing each other in games, their voices breaking the solemn silence. Servants carried sweetmeats and toys, gossiping in whispers. The Holy Father's sons, may God forgive us. A curious anecdote comes from the reign of Innocent VIII. Chroniclers note that at his deathbed in 1492, he was surrounded not by bishops or monks, but by a swarm of his many illegitimate children, some say as many as 16, clamouring for inheritance. The image is almost comical, if it weren't so tragic. The Vicar of Christ transformed into a weary patriarch of squabbling heirs, the papal chambers resounding not with hymns but with family quarrels. You can almost hear the chaos. Children demanding dowries, daughters sobbing, sons haggling over titles while their father gasped for air. And yet not all of these children thrived openly. Some were quietly tucked into monasteries or convents, their identities blurred. Picture a teenage boy in rough woolen robes, kneeling in a chapel, his face pale as he whispers prayers. Everyone around him knows whose blood flows in his veins, but no one dares speak. The silence is thicker than incense, and the boy's eyes are clouded with both pride and shame. Interpretations diverge sharply. Some historians argue that papal fatherhood reflected little more than noble custom after all. Kings and princes also sired illegitimate children without scandal. Others insist that such conduct undercut the very foundation of clerical celibacy, a wound that weakened the papacy's moral authority and fueled dissent. Perhaps the truth is both: personal indulgence dressed as politics, politics defended as family duty. You wander into a dim hall where portraits hang. A young man gazes out, robed as a cardinal, his face too smooth, his eyes too uncertain. This, you are told, is the Pope's son. His appointment is not a reward for devotion, but for bloodline. The candles flicker and his painted eyes seem to follow you. You feel the weight of hypocrisy pressing in, heavier than stone. One humorous yet biting story survives about Pope Paul III. He appointed 2 teenage grandsons as cardinals, one reportedly only 14. Rome responded with a bitter joke. Better to be the Pope's bastard than a saint's disciple. The quip circulated in taverns, sung in mocking songs, as if the city itself had decided satire was the only weapon left. You almost hear the coarse laughter of masons and bakers, their voices echoing off alley walls, mocking the gilded palace on the hill. The sensory details grow sharper as you walk. In the papal nursery you smell beeswax and warm milk, hear the clatter of toys carved from ivory, and the lullabies sung by nurses. Yet beneath the gentleness lurks something sour. The very existence of this nursery was a scandal, a thorn in the side of reformers. The Vatican, they insisted, should echo only prayers, not children's giggles. And still, these children shaped history. Cesare Borgia marched at the head of armies, his cunning inspiring Machiavelli's The Prince. Lucrezia Borgia, whether innocent or not, became the symbol of papal decadence. You sense how the sins of their father spilled far beyond the walls of Rome, reshaping politics and literature alike. Some researchers suggest that popes who acknowledged their children at least showed a form of honesty, compared to those who hid them. Others disagree, claiming that parading illegitimate heirs only deepened the scandal. The debate continues, unresolved, like the echo of small footsteps still running down marble corridors. You pause in a courtyard, moonlight shining on cold stone. A little boy kicks a leather ball, laughing, his laughter sharp against the silence of the night. He is the son of the Holy Father, though no one will say it aloud. The game seems innocent, but every kick of that ball thuds like a scandal reverberating through history. As you walk onward, the echo of children fades, replaced once more by silence, yet the memory clings, stubborn as incense on robes. The papacy claimed to renounce flesh, but in its hidden nurseries, it proved itself as human as any noble house. You carry with you the sound of giggles swallowed by stone, and the uneasy realization that even the successors of Peter could not escape the lure of legacy through blood. The laughter of children fades, and in its place you hear a far more chilling sound, chains dragging across marble, the groan of a coffin lid pried open. Tonight you stumble into one of the strangest, most macabre spectacles ever staged in Rome, the Cadaver Synod. Even the name makes you shiver. You picture the scene before you, a pope's corpse exhumed, dressed in full papal regalia, and placed on trial before the living. The records are clear enough. In 897, Pope Stephen VI convened a synod to try his predecessor, Pope Formosus, who had died months earlier. The body, already decayed, was dug from its tomb, seated on a throne, and questioned as if it could respond. The mainstream detail here is undeniable. The event happened, witnessed by clergy, recorded in chronicles, and remembered with horrified fascination for centuries. You imagine entering that hall. The stench hits you first, sweet and putrid, the odor of death mingling with incense. Candles flicker, their flames trembling in draughts. The corpse sits slumped on the throne, skin drawn tight over bone, papal robes hanging loosely on its frame. Its fingers, once raised in blessing, now curl like claws. The crown sits crooked on its skull. The sight alone must have made even hardened clerics gag. And yet the trial proceeds. Pope Stephen stands tall, his voice rising in accusation. The charges are recited. Formosus is guilty of perjury, of coveting the papacy, of violating canon law by transferring between bishoprics. Each word echoes absurdly, falling on ears of the dead. A deacon, trembling, is appointed to speak for the corpse. You can almost hear the grotesque parody questions asked, silence answered, the deacon mumbling invented replies in a voice barely audible over the pounding of hearts. A bizarre anecdote survives. Some say the corpse's hand was raised to take an oath, propped up by attendants, its dead fingers twitching as if mocking the ritual. Others claimed its head lolled forward, as if in shame. Whether truth or exaggeration, the image sears itself into your imagination, the trial of a pope transformed into a puppet show of death. The atmosphere must have been unbearable. Picture the clergy shifting in their seats, the smell of rot clinging to their robes, sweat trickling down their faces. Outside, the city buzzed with rumor, citizens craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what madness their leaders had unleashed. Rome had seen decadence before, but this was blasphemy of a new order. Opinions differ about why Stephen held this grotesque spectacle. Some historians argue it was a desperate political move meant to delegitimize Formosus's ordinations and weaken his supporters. Others think it was sheer madness, a pope unraveling beneath the weight of paranoia and ambition. The motives remain murky, but the result was disaster. You watch in horror as the verdict is declared: guilty. The corpse, already disgraced in death, is stripped of its robes, the sacred vestments yanked from brittle limbs. The crown clatters to the floor, the fingers once lifted in blessing are hacked off, the hand of a shepherd mutilated as the court jeers. The smell of burning wax mingles with the copper tang of decay. You shudder, feeling the cold stone beneath your feet as if you were truly there. A strange rumor lingers. After the trial, the corpse was dragged through the streets of Rome, jeered at by crowds, and finally thrown into the Tiber. Some said the river swelled in anger, flooding as if creation itself rejected the outrage. Others whispered that the body floated back to shore, a grim reminder that no scandal could be buried. You can almost hear the splash, the murmur of waves against stone, the uneasy silence of onlookers who crossed themselves in fear. The consequences were swift. The spectacle shocked even the jaded Romans, and Stephen himself was soon imprisoned and strangled to death by furious enemies. The papacy, meant to embody stability, had revealed itself as grotesque theatre, its sanctity drowned in the Tiber, along with Formosus's body. Yet the image endured. Satirists drew it in lurid detail, poets mocked it as proof of divine judgment, and reformers cited it as the lowest ebb of papal corruption. The Cadaver Synod became not just an event but a symbol, the absurd extremes to which ambition could drive holy men. You pause in the echoing chamber, your hand brushing cold stone, and the weight of it presses down on you. Imagine being a pilgrim in Rome at that time, hearing that the Pope had put a corpse on trial. Would you laugh, weep, or lose faith entirely? Perhaps all three. The echo of that absurdity still rattles down the centuries, a warning carved in shadow. One chronicler, half horrified and half amused, remarked that the court smelled more of carrion than of Christ. You almost smile grimly, because it feels true. The memory lingers, rank and unforgettable, like incense trapped in fabric. As you leave this chamber of grotesquerie, the images follow you: the crooked crown, the severed fingers, the splash of a body thrown into water. They trail behind you like ghosts, reminding you that even in the heart of the church, madness could reign unchecked. And you, weary traveller, carry the stink of that trial with you as you drift deeper into the papal labyrinth. The stench of the Cadaver Synod fades, but its echo lingers like a nightmare. You step into another chamber, one filled not with corpses, but with words, satire, ridicule, and bitter jokes whispered across Europe. Tonight you glimpse how the scandal of corrupt popes inspired pens as sharp as daggers, and how laughter itself became a weapon against the throne of Peter. The historical record makes it plain. Medieval Christendom often mocked its own shepherds. Monks, poets, and common folk alike crafted biting verses portraying popes not as holy fathers, but as greedy wolves dressed in shepherds' robes. Pamphlets and ballads circulated, lampooning the papacy as bloated, hypocritical, and ridiculous. You imagine hearing them sung in taverns, the smell of ale thick in the air, laughter rising as rhymes cut deeper than any sword. One striking example appears in a 12th century satire known as the Goliardic poems. These wandering scholars, irreverent, clever, half-drunk sang, verses mocking bishops and especially popes. They accused Rome of being less a city of saints than a marketplace for indulgence, where salvation could be bought as easily as wine. The mainstream truth is that such verses survive in manuscripts, their stinging rhymes echoing the mood of the age. Close your eyes and picture a smoky inn along a pilgrimage route. The air reeks of sweat and spilt beer, and over the din of dice on wood, a minstrel's voice rises. The Pope is a fattened ox, his tongue for hire, his belly, his altar. The crowd roars with laughter, though a hush falls when a stranger enters. What if he's an informer? You feel the thrill of danger in their mirth, the audacity of mocking the very man who claimed power over their souls. A peculiar anecdote clings to this tradition. In one satire, the Pope is depicted as sitting not on a throne, but on a giant wine barrel, blessing pilgrims with one hand while pocketing their coins with the other. Was it crude exaggeration? Almost certainly. Yet the popularity of the image reveals something deeper, that people needed humor to endure the contradiction between the Church's teachings and its leaders' behavior. Interpretations remain contested. Some scholars argue that such satires were fringe amusements, enjoyed by rebels and drunkards but not taken seriously. Others suggest they reflect a broader undercurrent of disillusionment spreading across Christendom, a slow erosion of trust that eventually culminated in the great fractures of the Reformation. You lean toward the latter, feeling the unease seeping through centuries like damp into stone. You imagine yourself wandering a medieval marketplace in Paris. The air is full of roasted chestnuts, animal dung, and wet wool. Amid the stalls, a juggler performs while reciting mocking verses about Rome's greed. Children laugh, peasants grin, and even merchants smirk behind their hands. Someone tosses him a coin not for blessing, but for blasphemy disguised as entertainment. The satire becomes currency, a rebellion bought and sold in plain sight. Another layer of ridicule came in visual form. Woodcuts and marginal illustrations in manuscripts often depicted popes with animal features, pig snouts, donkey ears, or wolfish fangs. One illuminator painted a pope blessing, a congregation of geese, a sly jab at blind obedience. You can almost hear the snickers of scribes hunched over their desks, the scratch of quills turning criticism into art. And satire was not confined to the laity. Even within the church, reform-minded clerics penned tracts dripping with sarcasm. One monk described Rome as a brothel with an altar. Another quipped that the papal treasury smelled more of garlic and sweat than sanctity. You sense their frustration, their words both a protest and a plea. A curious, almost humorous story floats from English chronicles. A ballad that claimed a pope once misread scripture during Mass because he was drunk, confusing "the Lord is my shepherd" with "the Lord is my cellar-master." Whether fact or parody, it circulated widely, a reminder that ridicule travelled faster than correction. The sensory world of satire is sharp. Hear the creak of parchment, the scratch of quills in candlelight, the murmured recitation of verses that could bring punishment if overheard by the wrong ears. Smell the wax melting, the ink drying, the nervous sweat of men daring to mock the most powerful institution in Europe. Feel the ripple of laughter rolling through a crowd that has long hungered for relief from fear. Experts still puzzle over the line between satire and truth. Did poems exaggerate, or were they sharper than official chronicles in capturing reality? The ambiguity is part of the scandal's endurance. Humor often smuggles in truths too dangerous to speak directly, and perhaps medieval satire preserved more honesty than official annals dared to record. Step out now into a quiet alley where a minstrel has finished his song. The night smells of damp straw. Your breath fogs in the cold air. The crowd has dispersed, but the laughter lingers, a ghostly echo in the dark. You realize how powerful it was. Laughter cracking the walls of fear, satire piercing the veil of sanctity, mockery reminding the world that even popes were mortal, fallible, absurd. And so you drift onward, leaving behind the tavern songs and mocking verses, carrying with you the uneasy smile they provoke. For satire is not only humor, it is also memory. a record etched in rhyme and ridicule, testifying that the papacy, cloaked in glory, was also the butt of Europe's jokes. The laughter from taverns dies away, and what replaces it is a harsher sound, the rattle of coin chests, the groans of peasants, the clink of scales in dimly lit rooms. Tonight you wander into the world of papal taxation, where Rome's coffers swelled on the backs of common folk. You smell it before you see it. Sweat, hay, and copper tang in the air, the scent of labour pressed into coins destined for the Vatican. It is firmly attested in chronicles that popes levied heavy dues on the faithful, extracting money for everything from marriages to burials. The system was elaborate, stretching across Christendom. Collectors, often despised more than the tax itself, roamed villages with parchments signed and sealed, demanding payment in the Pope's name. Their footsteps echoed like thunder in doorways, and their knock was dreaded as much as famine or plague. Picture a dusty road outside Florence. A papal collector arrives on horseback, his cloak trimmed with red to announce authority. Children scatter, dogs bark, and peasants gather nervously, clutching small purses. The collector dismounts, his boots crunching gravel, his face stern. He unrolls a parchment, reading aloud the decree. The peasants sigh, mutter prayers, and hand over coins that clink like chains into his wooden chest. You feel the heaviness of it, the sense that salvation itself has been taxed. One odd report survives from England. A collector, so despised, was locked in a pigsty overnight by angry villagers. By morning they dragged him before the local bishop, covered in filth, shouting that Rome feeds on swine. Whether apocryphal or true, the tale captures the resentment bubbling across Europe, where papal authority was often felt less in blessings than in emptied pockets. Inside Rome, the atmosphere of papal treasuries was no less suffocating. Imagine entering a vault lit by smoky lamps. Piles of coins glint in the dim light, their surfaces sticky with sweat from the hands that earned them. Scribes scratch away at ledgers, their quills squeaking as they tally the wealth. The room smells of ink, oil, and metal, a stark contrast to the fragrance of incense above in the chapels. Some scholars contend that these taxes were essential to maintain the vast machinery of the church armies, administration, building projects, and charity all required funding. Others argue they crossed into exploitation, turning faith into commerce. The debate endures, yet the resentment in the sources is undeniable. Even kings bristled at Rome's demands, occasionally defying or delaying payment, while commoners muttered that the Pope's blessing seemed tied too tightly to the weight of a coin purse. You wander further and hear the voices of the poor. A widow in a wool cloak pleads with a collector. She has no money for the burial of her husband. The collector's face softens for a moment, but he shakes his head. Rules are rules. She presses a single copper coin into his hand, barely enough, and he takes it. Her sobs echo as she leaves, the sound lodging itself in your chest. You can almost feel the coldness of that coin, heavy with grief. A strange anecdote circulates about Pope John XXIII, who supposedly boasted of leaving behind an enormous fortune in the papal treasury. Some said millions of florins. Rumours spread that his wealth was so vast he could pave the streets of Avignon in gold. Whether exaggerated or not, the claim stuck, fueling the sense that the Pope lived as a king while peasants groaned under the weight of his demands. The atmosphere in villages was tense whenever collectors appeared. Farmers hid coins under floorboards, wives stashed silver spoons in haystacks, children were sent to watch the road. But collectors always seemed to find their way, led by rumour or by neighbours eager to curry favour. The dread was not only of losing money, but of losing grace. Refusing to pay meant risking excommunication, and for medieval souls, that was a fate worse than hunger. Imagine the sound of the chest closing at day's end. The lid slams, iron lock clicks, and the coins inside shift with a dull roar. The collector smiles faintly, mounts his horse, and rides off, leaving dust and resentment in his wake. The peasants return to their fields, bent over with more than just labour. They carry the weight of Rome itself. Experts point out that resentment of papal taxation was one of the sparks that ignited revolts and reform. The English peasants' revolt in the 14th century, though fueled by many causes, carried chants against Rome's greedy levies. In Germany, later centuries would echo with Martin Luther's fury, much of it aimed at the commercialization of faith. The seeds of discontent were sown long before each coin dropped into papal chests was also a seed of rebellion. One curious, even comical note comes from a French village record. A collector once demanded hens as payment when coins were scarce. The villagers obliged, driving a squawking flock into his yard. By dawn, the birds had escaped, scattering across the fields. The villagers claimed it was divine justice that God himself refused to let Rome profit from their chickens. You can almost hear the laughter rippling through the fields, a rare moment of joy amid oppression. You stand now in the courtyard of a monastery, where carts loaded with grain wait to be shipped to Rome as tithe. The scent of wheat fills your nose, yet the monks frown, knowing the grain will feed papal banquets rather than hungry mouths nearby. The contradiction burns. You lean against a cold stone wall, wondering how many silent prayers rose to heaven, begging for a church that would give instead of take. The coins and grain disappear into the distance, but the bitterness remains. For peasants, papal taxation turned the Holy Father into a distant landlord, one who blessed with one hand and emptied pockets with the other. The image lingers as you walk on, a chest filled with clinking coins, carried away by horsemen, while behind them fields lie barren and hearts grow restless. The clatter of tax chests fades, but the echo of coins still rings in your ears. Tonight, you step into a different kind of marketplace, one that traded not grain or silver, but salvation itself. Here you witness the hawkers of indulgences, friars crying their wares in crowded squares, offering forgiveness in exchange for coin. The scent of roasted meats and fresh bread lingers in the air, but cutting through it is the voice of a preacher calling, "Buy your soul's freedom. Secure your loved ones from purgatory." The historical truth is well documented. Indulgences were originally meant as spiritual pardons, granted for acts of devotion, pilgrimages, or penance. But, by the later Middle Ages, they became commercialized, sold openly in towns across Europe. Rome reaped enormous profits, while common folk were urged to see salvation as something purchasable, like cloth or salt. The contradiction is glaring. The church that preached humility also ran a thriving business in forgiveness. Picture the scene in a bustling marketplace. Stalls overflow with fabrics, vegetables, and spices. A friar climbs onto a barrel, unrolling a parchment with bright seals. His voice booms above the crowd. For 1 coin, your sins are lightened. For 10, a soul is freed from purgatory. His hands flutter dramatically. His eyes gleam. Children gape. Women clutch their purses. Men mutter to one another. The friar waves a coffer, shaking it so coins rattle like thunder. The sound is both promise and threat. One peculiar detail survives in accounts. Some indulgent sellers carried printed certificates decorated with images of angels literally carrying souls out of fire. These were not simply documents, but visual sales pitches, designed to tug at the heart. You imagine a peasant staring at the flames etched in ink, fear prickling his skin, before pressing his last silver penny into the friar's hand. Interpretations differ on how widespread the abuse was. Some scholars argue indulgences were mostly well-intentioned, their sale exaggerated by critics. Others insist corruption was rampant, with friars pocketing more than they sent to Rome. Either way, the impression among commoners was unmistakable. Forgiveness had become a commodity, the mercy of God available for the right price. The atmosphere is sensory, almost theatrical. Hear the friar's voice rise and fall like a performer's. Smell the dust kicked up by shuffling feet as villagers press closer. Feel the weight of a coin in your palm, slick with sweat as you decide whether to buy your mother's soul out of suffering. Salvation becomes tactile metal pressed into wood, hope exchanged for currency. A humorous but biting story lingers about one indulgence preacher in Germany who, frustrated by a stingy crowd, thundered that their coins could even rescue a dead donkey from purgatory. The people laughed, but many still paid, half believing, half fearing. The absurdity didn't diminish the trade. If anything, it made it more colourful, more memorable, easier to spread. You step into a dim church where indulgence certificates are piled on a table. The smell of ink and parchment hangs heavy. A scribe dips his quill, writing names with practiced flourish, his hand steady though his soul may tremble. He knows each word is not merely a record, but a receipt of guilt transformed into profit. Outside the window, you hear the faint ringing of a blacksmith's hammer. Salvation and labour blend into one economy. Some reform-minded clergy condemned the practice, warning that it cheapened faith, yet others defended it fiercely, arguing that the funds supported noble causes: cathedrals, hospitals, crusades. The most famous defense came from indulgence campaigns to fund St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The stones of that grand church, still standing, are cemented not only with mortar, but with the pennies of peasants who believed they were buying eternity. A strange anecdote from the Chronicles says one preacher kept a little chest shaped like a church into which coins were dropped. As each coin fell, he declared, "The moment it rings, a soul springs." The rhyme was catchy, and children repeated it in streets. You can almost hear their sing-song voices, turning theology into playground chant, a mixture of innocence and irony. You wander through the crowd in your imagination, listening to the hum of voices. Some speak with relief. "Now Father is free." Others whisper resentment. "The friar took my bread money." The clash of emotions is palpable, as hope and anger intertwine. The indulgence trade wasn't only scandal, it was survival, both for the Vatican's coffers and for peasants desperate for certainty in an uncertain world. Experts continue to debate whether indulgences did more harm than good. Did they offer comfort to the faithful, or corrode the heart of religion? The answer may never be settled, but the image is enduring. A marketplace buzzing with cries of forgiveness for sale, a cross held in one hand, a coffer in the other. Step away now, into a quiet lane after the preacher has gone. The air is cooler, the noise subsides. You notice scraps of parchment left behind, a seal broken, ink smeared. A child picks one up, giggles, and waves it like a toy. To him it is nothing but paper, yet to his parents it might have been salvation. You realize how fragile faith becomes when entangled with coin. And so you carry onward, the sound of rattling coffers fading behind you, but the unease clinging like dust. The memory of indulgent sellers reminds you that even eternity was given a price tag in medieval Rome, and that the souls of men could be tallied like debts in a ledger. You walk deeper into the labyrinth, uneasy at how easily hope was traded for silver. The voices of indulgence sellers fade, but the scent of smoke lingers in your nostrils, not the incense of sanctuaries, but the pungent aroma of burning herbs and bubbling concoctions. Tonight you step into cellars beneath the papal palaces, places half forgotten in official chronicles, where rumour insists that popes and their courtiers dabbled in strange arts. Here the line between faith and alchemy blurred, the sacred chalice sharing space with crucibles and glass vials. The documented fact is that medieval popes patronized science, medicine, and even astrology, but whispers claim some went further, experimenting in secret with substances that seemed closer to magic than to medicine. In an age where turning lead into gold obsessed nobles and scholars alike, it is not unthinkable that the men who commanded Christendom might also peer into flasks and powders, curious to grasp hidden powers. You descend into a damp chamber in your imagination. The stone walls sweat with moisture, torches hiss in sconces, and a work table glitters with bottles, green glass, clay jars, brass instruments. The air smells of sulphur and vinegar, sharp enough to sting your nose. A pope, robe hitched high to avoid spilling ash, leans over the table. His fingers are stained with soot, his eyes gleam with fascination. To the world he is the vicar of Christ. Here, in the cellar's flickering light, He is a student of secrets. A curious tale circles around Pope John the 2012. While his official decrees condemned witchcraft, rumors spread that he privately supported alchemical studies, even issuing privileges to scholars who claimed to pursue the philosopher's stone. Some reports say he hoarded texts considered dangerous, filling papal libraries with manuscripts on astrology, numerology, and the properties of metals. You can almost picture him in a candlelit study, parchment spread before him, lips moving silently as he traced diagrams of spheres and sigils. The atmosphere of such clandestine curiosity is intoxicating. Hear the hiss of liquids poured into flasks, the crackle of fire under cauldrons. Smell the acrid smoke, feel the heat on your face, sense the thrill of discovery mingled with dread of blasphemy. In those moments, the Pope becomes both priest and sorcerer, both shepherd and seeker. Not all agreed on the nature of these pursuits. Some chroniclers denounced them as heretical, claiming the popes risked damnation by consorting with forbidden arts. Others suggest these were practical explorations, early chemistry disguised under mystical language. Scholars today remain divided. Were papal alchemists charlatans chasing gold, or pioneers of knowledge cloaked in secrecy? The answer dissolves like smoke, leaving only speculation. One odd anecdote claims that a papal courtier once tried to brew an elixir of immortality in the Vatican kitchens, mixing honey, wine, and powdered emerald. The concoction was so foul that tasters spat it out, and the recipe was quietly burned. Still, the legend persists, a reminder of the strange experiment said to hum beneath the chapels above. Step into a different corner of the cellar. Here, parchments lie scattered, sketches of the stars drawn with careful precision. Some popes were known to consult astrologers before issuing decrees, their decisions timed with the movement of planets. Imagine a pontiff leaning close to an astrologer, the scent of wax and ink heavy in the air, listening intently as the man points to a star chart. This is the hour to strike, Holy Father. Delay, and the heavens will frown. The contradiction is sharp. On one hand, the Church condemned superstition and magic. On the other, its highest leaders seem to indulge in them privately. You can almost hear the whispers of servants carrying trays into the cellar, pretending not to see the strange powders staining the Pope's hands. The silence of complicity becomes another ingredient in the mix. A humorous yet unsettling story is told of a pope who feared poisoning so much that he ordered his alchemists to invent a universal antidote. They produced a syrup so bitter it was nearly undrinkable. The pope forced cardinals to take doses at banquets, claiming it would protect them. Guests gagged, coughed and wept from the taste, but none dared refuse. Satirists called it the wine of worms, laughing that Rome's holy fathers had become apothecaries gone mad. The sensory imagery lingers. You run your hand along a cold brass alembic, still warm from the fire. You hear the pop of bubbles, the hiss of steam. You see the Pope's face lit by flame, his eyes caught between curiosity and fear. Was he chasing knowledge or power? Was he hoping to discover God's secrets through glass and powder? Some researchers suggest that papal interest in alchemy mirrored the wider hunger of the age, to understand creation, to control it, to bring order out of chaos. Others claim it was greed, an attempt to conjure limitless wealth. Perhaps both motives swirled together, like smoke from a dying torch. You climb back up the stairs in your imagination, leaving the cellar behind. The air grows fresher, the smell of sulphur replaced by incense drifting through chapels. Yet the memory clings, the sight of vials, the taste of bitter syrup, the whisper of astrologers timing decrees to the stars. It leaves you uneasy, wondering whether the line between faith and forbidden knowledge was ever truly clear. And so you step onward into the labyrinth of scandal, carrying with you the faint odor of sulphur and the uneasy laughter of alchemists in papal cellars. The scent of sulphur fades as you ascend the stairs, but the clamor of iron fills your ears, shields clashing, swords ringing, the neigh of restless horses. Tonight you see the papacy not in robes and mitres, but in mail and steel. This is the scandal of popes who marched as generals, wielding swords instead of psalms, leading men into bloody fields under banners marked with the cross. One fact that no historian disputes is that several medieval popes personally took command of armies. The papal office was not only spiritual but territorial, and to defend the papal states meant battle. Imagine Innocent II riding at the head of knights in the 12th century, or Julius II in the early 16th century, though just beyond our medieval window marching into battle fully armed, known as the warrior pope. The paradox bites sharply. The successors of Peter, who once preached peace and turned the other cheek, now strapped on armor and spurred war horses across muddy fields. Picture the moment. Dawn breaking over a Roman camp. The air is heavy with dew and the scent of leather, sweat and smoke from last night's fires. Soldiers stir awake, sharpening blades, muttering prayers. And in the center, a pope emerges from a richly adorned tent, clad not in silk robes but in chainmail, a gleaming sword at his side. The troops cheer, their voices rough, their faith stirred less by sermons than by the sight of a Holy Father ready to bleed with them. A strange anecdote lingers about Pope Leo IX, who personally led forces against Norman invaders in the 11th century. Chroniclers note that he fought bravely but was captured, paraded as a prisoner. Imagine the humiliation a pope, vicar of Christ, shackled and displayed like a defeated baron. His captors mocked him, yet treated him with a peculiar respect, knowing his symbolic power outweighed his military skill. You can almost hear the clash of armor, the jeers of soldiers, the clink of chains as the pontiff shuffled through the dust. The atmosphere of these papal campaigns is vivid. Trumpets blare, banners snap in the wind, prayers are muttered hastily before charges, horses snort, their breath steaming in the cold morning. You hear the clash of swords, the screams of the wounded, the frantic prayers of dying men. In the distance, church bells toll, but their solemn call is drowned by the roar of war. Interpretations vary among scholars. Some argue the popes had little choice. The papal states were real territories requiring defense, and no ruler could afford to appear weak. Others condemn the spectacle outright, claiming it corrupted the office beyond recognition, turning pastors into warmongers. The truth likely lies between necessity dressed as zeal, zeal warped by ambition. Another peculiar story tells of Pope Boniface VIII, who was said to carry a sword in one hand and the keys of St. Peter in the other during ceremonies. A chronicler mocked him by writing, "He holds the keys to heaven, but swings the sword of earth." The satire stuck, whispered in markets, spreading the image of a pontiff torn between altar and battlefield. Step into a war camp at dusk. The air reeks of blood and damp earth. Fires crackle, roasting meat for weary soldiers. In the Pope's tent, armor rests against a chair, dented from battle. The pontiff kneels in prayer, his hands trembling, his lips whispering for victory. Outside, men gamble with dice, curse and sing. The contradiction is raw, a shepherd leading his flock not to pasture but to war. And yet, some soldiers found hope in this. To fight under a pope was to believe that heaven itself marched beside them. Victory seemed more certain, death less fearful. The pope's presence sanctified the slaughter. You can almost hear their chants rising into the night, rough voices blending with the solemnity of hymns, creating a sound both holy and horrifying. A humorous, biting anecdote survives about Julius II, though late medieval, who supposedly swore at his troops in language so vulgar that chroniclers hesitated to record it. They joked he was more at home in a barracks than in St. Peter's. You smile at the image, a pope hurling curses as arrows fly, his soldiers laughing at the absurdity of it all. Scholars still argue whether the warrior popes weakened or strengthened the papacy. Did their swords defend Rome's independence, or did they tarnish its spiritual authority beyond repair? The debate flickers like torchlight, never settled, each interpretation shadowed by blood. You walk now across a battlefield in your imagination. The ground squelches under your feet, mud mixed with blood. Broken spears lie scattered, shields cracked. A discarded papal banner lies torn, its cross stained crimson. The silence is eerie, broken only by the moans of the wounded. In that stillness you feel the full weight of the scandal. Salvation proclaimed by men who wielded swords as eagerly as prayers. As you leave, the clang of steel still echoes in your ears. You carry with you the image of armored pontiffs, their faces hidden by helmets, their hands gripping weapons meant to kill. The contradiction bites deep popes as both shepherds and soldiers, priests and generals. And you, weary traveller, drift onward, burdened with the clang of battle that refuses to fade. The battlefield dust settles behind you, yet the air remains heavy. You step into a different landscape altogether, where the clang of swords is replaced by the clipped accents of French courtiers, the scent of roses from manicured gardens, and the rustle of silk in gilded halls. Tonight you arrive at Avignon, the papacy in exile, what critics called the Babylonian captivity. For nearly 70 years, popes lived not in Rome but in the south of France, and in that shift lay scandal enough to shake Christendom. The well-documented fact is simple. From 1309 to 1377, 7 consecutive popes resided in Avignon, under the shadow of French kings. The papacy, once the heartbeat of Rome, seemed transplanted to a palace on the Rhône. To supporters it was safer, more orderly, free from Roman mobs. To detractors, it was betrayal, Peter's throne uprooted, God's city abandoned. You imagine pilgrims arriving in Rome only to find empty palaces, their prayers echoing in deserted basilicas. The silence of St. Peter's must have felt like abandonment itself. Step into the Avignon court in your imagination. You see halls lined with tapestries, kitchens bustling with servants, tables groaning under delicacies. The smell of roasted pheasant and cinnamon drifts through corridors, mingling with the perfume of courtiers. This was no humble refuge, it was a glittering court, rivaling the palaces of kings. Diplomats bowed, musicians played, and poets praised the splendor. You almost feel the velvet brush against your arm, hear the chiming laughter of noble guests, taste the sugared almonds served on silver trays. One curious report survives. Petrarch, the Italian poet, visited Avignon and scornfully called it the sink of all vices. He complained of clerics drowning in luxury, gossip echoing louder than hymns, gold outshining sanctity. His bitter words still sting, giving us an outsider's glimpse of a papacy that looked less like Christ's shepherd and more like a royal court. Interpretations vary on why the papacy settled there. Some historians emphasize security. Rome was unstable, riddled with factions, and the French crown offered safety. Others argue it was political domination, the popes becoming puppets of French kings. Perhaps both are true. You feel the tension in every whisper. Was the Pope master of Christendom, or merely another noble bending to royal will? A strange anecdote captures the excess. Chronicles tell of banquets in Avignon where whole orchards of fruit were served, each pear polished, each apple gilded with gold leaf. Guests gasped at the extravagance while peasants outside the gates gnawed stale bread. Imagine the sight, rows of glittering fruit, untouched and gleaming, a feast as much for the eyes as the stomach. You almost hear the murmurs of envy and outrage floating on the night air. The sensory details are rich. In the papal palace you hear fountains splashing in marble courtyards, the clicking of chess pieces as bishops played idly, the murmur of secret conversations in corridors lined with velvet. You smell incense mixed with the musk of perfumes from Provence, the sweetness of honey cakes, the tang of strong French wine. Every sense is overwhelmed, and the sheer opulence presses down on you like a heavy cloak. Critics across Europe fumed. Satirists called the Avignon popes prisoners, while reformers denounced them as traitors to Rome. Meanwhile, the papal treasury swelled, funded by taxes and indulgences. The contradiction was unbearable. The successor of Peter, fisherman of Galilee, ruling from a palace so sumptuous that even monarchs envied it. You wonder if the popes themselves ever looked out across the Rhone, longing for Rome's rough stones, or if velvet dulled their nostalgia. One biting story recounts that when pilgrims complained about Rome's emptiness, a French courtier scoffed, "Peter's bones remain there. What more do you need?" The remark, whether true or not, circulated widely, fueling the sense that Avignon had reduced the papacy to mockery. You can almost hear the sarcastic laughter it provoked in Roman taverns, the clinking of wine cups raised in bitter toasts. And yet, for all its scandal, the Avignon papacy left legacies. Administrative reforms strengthened the papal bureaucracy. Archives expanded. Diplomacy flourished. Some scholars argue it was not decline but evolution, a step toward modern governance. Others reject that, insisting the exile corroded the Church's moral authority. The debate still flickers, like torchlight against old stone. Step into the gardens outside the palace. The night air is soft, scented with roses and lavender. You hear frogs croaking in the river below, and faint strains of music from inside. A pope walks slowly among the hedges, his robe brushing dew-damp grass. Perhaps he sighs, wondering if he will ever see Rome again. Perhaps he does not care. The ambiguity hangs heavy, more fragrant than the flowers. A humorous anecdote clings to one Avignon pope. John the 22 was said to have fallen asleep during a sermon, snoring so loudly that courtiers giggled behind their hands. The image spread in jokes, Rome mocking that even the pope found his own court too dull. You chuckle softly at the thought, though the humor is edged with sadness. You turn back toward Rome in your imagination, feeling the distance keenly. The city waits, empty and resentful, while its shepherds recline in foreign luxury. For pilgrims, the road to salvation now led through Provence, a detour that felt like betrayal. The papacy had become unmoored, drifting like a ship in foreign waters, its anchor pulled up from Peter's tomb. And as you leave Avignon's glittering halls behind, you carry with you the echo of fountains, the shimmer of gold-leafed fruit, and the uneasy knowledge that even the throne of Peter could be transplanted when politics demanded. The scandal of exile whispers in your ear that the papacy was never only holy, but also vulnerable, pliable, and very much human. The lavender-scented air of Avignon fades, and in its place you hear thunder not from the sky but from the mouths of men hurling curses. Tonight you wander into the nightmare of Christendom's great fracture, the Western Schism, when rival popes hurled excommunications like lightning bolts and Europe split in two, each half convinced the other was damned. The fact is undeniable. From 1378 to 1417, the Catholic world endured a period when more than one man claimed the papal throne. At one point, there were even three. Rome, Avignon, and Pisa each boasted its own pontiff, each insisting he alone wore Peter's mantle. Imagine the chaos. Kings forced to choose allegiance, bishops torn between obedience and rebellion, peasants bewildered as to which pope's blessing actually counted. You step into Rome first. The Lateran bells toll, echoing over the Tiber. Crowds gather in the square, staring up at a pope who raises his hand in blessing. But far away in Avignon, another pope does the same, his jeweled fingers forming the same sign. And in Pisa, yet another pontiff mirrors the gesture. The same ritual, repeated thrice, each claiming to hold the keys of heaven. Which one opens the gates? The faithful must have shivered at the uncertainty. One vivid episode shines in the chronicles. Urban VI in Rome and Clement VII in Avignon traded insults as freely as curses. Urban accused Clement of being a usurper. Clement branded Urban as a bloodthirsty tyrant. Letters flew across Europe, each filled with venom. You imagine parchment crinkling, quills scratching furiously, ink splattering as secretaries raced to keep up with their enraged masters. The air in their courts must have smelled of hot wax and sweat, thick with tension. A strange anecdote survives from this quarrel. It is said Urban VI grew so paranoid that he tortured and executed cardinals he suspected of disloyalty, their screams echoing through Roman palaces. Meanwhile, Clement in Avignon sought refuge in the luxuries of his French court, prompting wags to quip that one pope ruled by fear, the other by feasts. The contrast was sharp enough to fuel endless satire. Interpretations diverge even now. Some historians see the schism as a purely political contest, born of national rivalries between France and Italy. Others argue it was a spiritual crisis, a visible wound that made ordinary believers question the very unity of the Church. Perhaps it was both. You can almost feel the tremors in the pews as peasants asked their priests, whose absolution counts, whose Eucharist is true. No priest could answer with certainty. Step into a tavern in Cologne in the 1382nd. The air is thick with pipe smoke, ale foams in mugs, and merchants argue heatedly. One swears loyalty to Rome's pope, another curses him and insists Avignon's pontiff is legitimate. The crowd erupts into shouting, mugs slam on tables, fists nearly fly. For common folk, the schism was not abstract theology, it was lived confusion, a daily question of loyalty. An odd detail recounted by chroniclers is that some households hedged their bets. They hung images of both popes side by side, praying to whichever might turn out to be real. You picture a family kneeling before two icons, whispering prayers hurriedly to each, hoping at least one would reach heaven. The scene borders on absurd, yet it reveals the desperation of believers caught in the middle. The atmosphere of the period is darkly comic and tragic all at once. Hear the clatter of councils convened, bishops arguing until their throats were raw. Smell the damp parchment. See the piles of decrees discarded as obsolete when yet another rival pope appeared. The Church's unity, once its proudest boast, fractured like a mirror, each shard reflecting a different face of authority. One story tells of a satirical song sung by German students. 3 keys hang at heaven's gate, but none will open wide. Their mocking voices echoed through university halls, a bitter joke that captured the absurdity of 3 pontiffs vying for one throne. You can almost hear the laughter, sharp and nervous, covering a deeper fear. The schism dragged on for decades, until the Council of Constance finally resolved it in 1417, deposing or accepting resignations and electing Martin V. But the scars never fully healed. Trust in the papacy had been shattered. For nearly 40 years, ordinary Christians lived in doubt, unsure whether their confessions were heard, their marriages blessed, their dead absolved. The wound cut deep, and reformers of later centuries would point back to it as proof of Rome's fallibility. You pause now in a silent cloister, the night air cool around you. Imagine a monk kneeling in prayer during the schism, his heart heavy. He whispers psalms, but doubt gnaws at him. Which pope do I obey? Does God hear me, or am I lost in the quarrels of men? His candle flickers, the wax dripping steadily, marking time in a world where certainty had crumbled. A curious anecdote claims that some merchants exploited the confusion, selling duplicate indulgences stamped with seals of rival popes, assuring buyers that at least one of them was valid. Buyers laughed nervously, but they still paid. You can almost hear the coins drop, hope mingled with cynicism. As you step away from this fractured century, you feel the weight of division pressing on your chest. The schism was more than political rivalry. It was a wound in the soul of Europe, a scandal that made mockery of unity. The sound of rival popes' curses still echoes in your ears as you drift onward, deeper into the labyrinth of papal secrets. The roar of rival curses fades, yet you find yourself gazing upward into the night sky. Stars burn like pinpricks above the darkened city, and you sense another layer of papal scandal, not blood or coin this time, but starlight. Tonight you step into the world of astrology, when popes, for all their proclamations of faith, bent their ears to the whispers of the heavens before declaring decrees or waging wars. It is well established that astrology held sway over medieval courts, but what unsettles you is how deeply it reached into the papacy itself. Records show that pontiffs consulted astrologers before papal elections, coronations, even diplomatic ventures. These were not fringe curiosities, they were woven into the very rhythms of Vatican life. Imagine the Vicar of Christ leaning over a chart of planets, tracing Mars and Saturn with his finger, and pausing to consider whether the stars approved his next move. The sensory details are vivid. Picture a chamber in the Lateran. Oil lamps flicker, casting yellow light over parchment covered in circles, symbols, and star maps. The smell of wax and ink hangs in the air, sharp and faintly metallic. An astrologer in a dark robe mutters calculations, his finger moving across the page. The Pope sits silently, listening, nodding as if scripture itself were being read aloud. You can almost hear the scratch of a quill, the low murmur of Latin prayers mixed uneasily with planetary predictions. One striking example survives. Pope Sixtus IV is said to have consulted astrologers about the foundation of the Sistine Chapel, choosing dates not only for ceremonial significance, but for favorable planetary alignments. Whether true or embellished, the story lingers as a reminder of how heavenly architecture was married to the movement of stars. A curious tidbit comes from Pope Paul II, who supposedly died after a night of excessive melon eating in 1471, though whispers claimed he had been studying horoscopes when struck down. Satirists twisted the tale into mockery. He trusted melons and stars more than God. Whether factual or not, the blend of humor and scorn captures how astrology's shadow over the papacy invited ridicule. Interpretations differ on the meaning of this fascination. Some historians argue astrology was seen as natural science at the time, not superstition, and that popes embraced it as part of intellectual curiosity. Others insist it betrayed hypocrisy. How could men who condemn divination also time their decrees to planetary conjunctions? The contradiction hovers in the air, unresolved, shimmering like the stars themselves. You wander through an imagined night in Rome. The streets are hushed, the air cool. On a balcony, a pope peers at the sky through an early astrolabe, its brass surface catching moonlight. Servants stand behind him, their breath visible in the chill. He whispers questions into the darkness. Will war favor me? Will my enemies falter? Will the church endure? No answer comes, save the eternal silence of the heavens. And yet, he turns away, comforted, convinced the stars had spoken. One humorous anecdote clings to the chronicles. During a papal election, some cardinals allegedly refused to begin voting until the astrologers declared the hour auspicious. Rome joked that the keys of heaven had been misplaced until the stars handed them back. You can almost hear the laughter in taverns, wine cups raised high, the people muttering, "Our Pope is chosen by Jupiter, not Peter." The sensory impression deepens. In papal libraries, manuscripts on astronomy and astrology sit side by side with scripture. You smell the leather bindings, the musk of old parchment. You run your hand over diagrams of constellations inked in bright red and blue. The mix of sacred and profane feels dizzying, as if the church itself walked a tightrope between revelation and divination. Experts continue to question whether astrology truly guided papal policy or merely offered psychological comfort. Was it decisive or decorative? Did popes consult stars in earnest, or simply to appease the fashion of their age? The answer remains elusive, like a constellation glimpsed through clouds. But the mere fact that the question exists reveals how far scandalous rumor and unsettling truth intertwine. Step now into a private chapel at midnight. Candles burn low, casting halos of light. An astrologer kneels beside an altar, presenting a chart to the Pope. The host and chalice glimmer behind them, symbols of eternal faith. Yet here they are joined by a parchment predicting planetary influence. The juxtaposition jars you. Heaven invoked in two languages, scripture and starlight. A final anecdote drifts from the margins. One pope, fearing assassination, refused to leave his chamber until Mars moved out of a threatening house. For days, the papal court ground to a halt. Audiences postponed. Envoys kept waiting, all because of a star's imagined menace. Satirists quipped that the Pope was ruled by Mars, not Christ. The tale may exaggerate, but you can almost hear the groans of waiting diplomats, the shuffling of restless guards, the absurdity stretching long into the night. As you leave this chamber of stars, the night sky follows you. The constellations twinkle, cold and remote, reminders that men who claim to speak for heaven still sought answers from the silent patterns above. You carry with you the faint rustle of parchment, the gleam of brass astrolabes, and the uneasy sense that even popes could not resist looking upward, hoping the stars might whisper secrets of power. The stars dim behind you, and as you step back into Rome, the air grows heavier. The whispers of astrologers fade, replaced by a more sordid murmur, drifting through the streets. Tonight you confront one of the ugliest rumors clinging to the papacy, that Rome itself, under papal authority, profited from brothels. You walk narrow lanes where shutters hang askew, the smell of sweat, wine, and cheap perfume rising in the night. The scandal lies not only in the existence of vice, but in the suggestion that the church itself pocketed its share of the earnings. The truth is complicated. Official records confirm that Rome, like every medieval city, teemed with brothels. They were tolerated, sometimes regulated, even taxed. What unsettles you is that papal authorities directly or indirectly sanctioned this commerce, and in some periods, the Vatican treasury is thought to have benefited from the revenue. Imagine the paradox: the vicar of Christ issuing bulls against sin by day, while tax collectors counted the profits of prostitution by night. Step into a Roman alley of the 15th century. Lanterns glow dimly, laughter spills from behind wooden doors, the scent of roasted chestnuts mingles with musk. A friar walks briskly past, eyes averted, but his footsteps slow at the sound of a coin box rattling just inside. Above the door hangs a crude sign, a red lamp, the universal signal, and in the shadow of St. Peter's dome, these houses flourished, tolerated by clerics who whispered that vice, when controlled, kept greater evils at bay. One strange anecdote survives in the satire of the time. A chronicler claimed the papal treasurer once referred to prostitutes as "our sisters in revenue," whether fact or mockery. The line circulated widely, whispered in taverns with bitter laughter. You can almost hear the bark of laughter from a mason at the bar, shaking his head at the absurdity: saints in heaven, harlots on earth, and Rome's Holy Father profiting from both. Interpretations vary sharply. Some historians argue the Vatican's role was indirect, that revenues were collected by civic authorities and only later shared with papal treasuries. Others insist the connection was deliberate, a system rationalized as a way of keeping sin contained while filling coffers. The debate remains unsettled, but the smell of scandal hangs thick in the air. Inside one of these imagined brothels, the scene is vivid. Candles sputter, curtains of faded velvet hang loosely, the sound of a lute drifts lazily. Women in kohl-lined eyes and bright dresses laugh too loudly, their hands heavy with cheap rings. A soldier clanks in with boots still caked in mud, tossing a coin on the table. In a corner sits a collector, ledger open, tallying quietly as if in any marketplace. The juxtaposition is stark. Sin recorded like wheat or wine, the holy city's shadow ledger. A curious rumor clings to Pope Sixtus IV. While he is best remembered for commissioning the Sistine Chapel, detractors claimed his reign also saw the institutionalization of brothel taxes in Rome. Whether exaggerated by enemies or not, the idea that the Pope who built one of Christendom's greatest chapels may also have profited from prostitution lodged itself firmly in the imagination of reformers. You feel the irony, sharp as vinegar in the nose. The atmosphere on the streets was charged. Pilgrims muttered prayers as they passed these houses, clutching their rosaries more tightly. Locals shrugged, accustomed to the mingling of sacred and profane. The air buzzed with contradiction. Bells tolled from churches, while laughter and moans spilled from doorways just streets away. You almost smell incense wafting from a chapel window, colliding with the musky perfume from a brothel across the square. One peculiar tale, half comic and half bitter, tells of a prostitute who boasted that she confessed weekly to a priest, who was also her most loyal client. The story may be invention, but it captures the cynicism that spread like smoke through Europe, Rome's sins laid bare, tangled hopelessly with its sanctities. Scholars continue to debate whether papal involvement in brothels was pragmatic tolerance or moral collapse. Some argue that regulation of vice was seen as protection, better to control sin than to let it run wild. Others reject such excuses, insisting the papacy's very flirtation with this commerce symbolized betrayal of its spiritual role. The truth, as always, lies in the uneasy middle, necessity entwined with corruption, control blurred with complicity. Step outside once more, into the Roman night. The moon is high, washing alleys in pale silver. A group of pilgrims hurries past, clutching candles, whispering hymns. Across the street, laughter erupts as a door bangs open, spilling light and music onto the cobblestones. For a moment, the two sounds mingle, hymn and laughter, prayer and lust, until the pilgrims vanish into shadow, and the brothel door slams shut. You feel the tension, the city itself split in two. One last anecdote lingers, told by reformers with relish. A German visitor to Rome wrote home that he had seen more prostitutes than priests in the streets, and that both seemed equally prosperous. Was it exaggeration? Almost certainly. But exaggeration rooted in perception can wound as deeply as fact, and the papacy's reputation suffered scars it could never fully erase. As you leave these shadowed lanes, the smell of musk and wine clings stubbornly, like smoke in your clothes. You carry with you the uneasy realization that the Church once tolerated sin as business, that the sacred and profane shared the same streets, the same ledgers, sometimes even the same hands. The scandal of papal brothels lingers not only as rumor, but as a reminder of the uneasy bargain between morality and survival. The laughter from Rome's brothels fades, yet your steps carry you deeper into shadow, toward locked doors and forbidden shelves. Tonight you enter the papal library, not the official halls lined with saints' writings and illuminated Bibles, but the hidden alcoves, the cupboards barred by iron, where books too dangerous for the faithful were kept under guard. This is the scandal of knowledge itself, when popes collected what they also condemned, preserving manuscripts that the wider church branded heresy. It is firmly recorded that popes maintained archives of banned works, often seizing them from scholars or heretics. On the surface, these collections were for judgment books to be examined, condemned, and then locked away. But rumor suggests a darker fascination, that some popes read them, studied them, perhaps even admired them in secret. The contradiction is almost unbearable. You imagine a pontiff raising his hand in public to burn a manuscript, then sneaking into a dim library that same night to read another copy by candlelight. Picture the chamber, stone walls pressing close, the air dry and thick with dust. Shelves creak under the weight of bound volumes, their spines cracked, their titles written in Latin, Greek, Arabic. The smell of old parchment mingles with the faint scent of wax. A pope slips inside, hood drawn low, a lamp flickering in his hand. He runs his fingers across the bindings, choosing one. The flame dances across titles of astronomy, medicine, alchemy, even pagan philosophy. His lips part in curiosity, though his heart beats with fear. One curious note survives in Chronicles about Pope Sylvester II, a scholar before his papacy. Whispers claimed he had studied magic in Spain, acquiring books of forbidden knowledge from Arab libraries. Later, enemies accused him of keeping a demon locked in a brass head that spoke answers to his questions. Was this reality or slander? Most likely rumor, yet the story lingers, revealing how closely curiosity and suspicion intertwined in the medieval imagination. Another odd report tells of Pope Nicholas V, who in the 15th century avidly collected classical texts, some condemned as pagan. His critics accused him of polluting the church with dangerous wisdom. You imagine the scene, crates of manuscripts arriving from distant lands, opened under torchlight, the smell of sea salt still clinging to them. Monks shake their heads, muttering that these are the words of heathens, while the Pope smiles faintly, eager to expand his hidden trove. The atmosphere of these secret shelves is intoxicating. Hear the creak of leather bindings as books are pulled from storage. Smell the musk of parchment, tinged with ink that has faded to brown. Feel the rough edge of vellum under your fingertips, the weight of words centuries old. You sense the tension knowledge locked away like treasure, guarded and feared at once. Interpretations of these libraries remain divided. Some scholars argue they were tools of censorship, meant only to contain dangerous texts. Others believe they were personal playgrounds for popes who could not resist curiosity. Perhaps both are true. You can almost hear the debate in the shuffle of footsteps. Were the locked cupboards, prisons, or sanctuaries? A humorous but biting anecdote survives from satire. A lampoon claimed that one pope kept Ovid's Ars Amatoria, a manual of love, under his pillow. He reads prayers by day and pleasures by night, the poet sneered. Likely fiction, but the jest resonated because it felt plausible, and rumours often endure longer than truth. Step into the forbidden reading room. A long wooden table stretches across the chamber, its surface scarred by candle drips and quill scratches. On it lies a manuscript, open to strange diagrams, circles within circles, stars drawn in ink, numbers that seem to pulse with hidden meaning. A pope bends over it, his breath stirring the pages, his eyes wide with wonder. Outside, bells toll for vespers, but he does not rise. His prayer tonight is to knowledge itself. The contradiction grows sharper as you recall that the Church burned heretics for reading such texts. Imagine a scholar dragged to the stake for studying astrology, while the same work sat quietly on papal shelves, safe behind locked doors. The irony is thick, bitter as wormwood. You almost hear the crackle of flames, the cries of the condemned, their words lost even as their books survived in Vatican cupboards. One striking story tells of Pope Sixtus IV commissioning a catalogue of forbidden works. The irony? By listing them, he inadvertently preserved their names for posterity, ensuring they were remembered rather than forgotten. You can almost hear the chuckle of a librarian as he copied the list, muttering, "To ban a book is to keep it alive." Experts continue to puzzle over the role of these hidden libraries. Were they instruments of control, evidence of hypocrisy, or acts of preservation that paradoxically saved knowledge for later centuries? The debate is lively, unresolved, a tug-of-war between condemnation and curiosity. You pause in a narrow aisle between shelves. Dust motes float in lamplight. Your breath stirs the silence. You imagine the weight of secrets pressing in the voices of ancient authors, pagan and heretical, whispering from the pages. You sense the thrill that must have tugged at papal hearts. Forbidden fruit plucked not from orchards, but from ink and parchment. A final anecdote lingers in whispers. Some claimed that when the Vatican burned heretical books in public squares, duplicate copies were quietly stored away in cellars. You almost see the scene, the crackle of flames, crowds cheering as pages turned to ash, while down in a vault, a servant locked away another copy, the smell of smoke mingling with the dust of hidden shelves. Whether true or rumour, the story captures the paradox perfectly. The papacy both destroyer and preserver, censor and collector. As you leave the chamber, the smell of old books clings to you, dry and sweet like parchment itself. You carry with you the uneasy realization that the Vatican's greatest scandal was not only flesh or coin, but curiosity, that even as popes thundered against forbidden knowledge, they could not resist turning the pages. The musty scent of forbidden books fades as you climb a spiral stair, and the air suddenly turns sharp with the smell of smoke and sickness. Tonight you walk into a darker chapter. The plague years, when death cloaked Europe in silence and even popes fled the eternal city. The scandal was not simply pestilence itself, but the image of the shepherd abandoning his flock while Rome rotted in its own streets. The Black Death of the 14th century left no corner untouched. Corpses piled in alleys, bells tolled endlessly, and the stench of decay hung heavy. Contemporary accounts describe carts rattling through Rome by night, filled with the dead, their bodies heaped like cordwood. Dogs howled in deserted squares, priests collapsed beside parishioners, and silence fell over basilicas once crowded with pilgrims. The papacy, symbol of stability, seemed to vanish into exile at precisely the moment it was needed most. Picture the scene. You step into St. Peter's Square in your imagination, but the air is not filled with incense, it reeks of rot. Flies buzz thickly. A body slumps against the steps, mouth agape, eyes clouded. The square is deserted, save for a lone friar who shuffles forward, sprinkling holy water with a trembling hand. He coughs into his sleeve, and you know he too will soon fall. The city is a tomb, echoing with silence broken only by the creak of carts and the wail of mothers. One firmly attested episode is Pope Clement VI's retreat to Avignon during the plague. He secluded himself in chambers surrounded by constantly burning fires, believing the flames would purify the air. Servants stoked logs day and night until the rooms glowed red, the heat unbearable. Imagine stepping into that chamber, the air thick, suffocating, like standing inside an oven. Clement reclined on cushions, breathing heavily, sweat beading his brow, yet convinced the fiery walls would save him. A curious story lingers. Clement supposedly issued a decree granting remission of sins to anyone who died of the plague, since no priest could reach them in time. It was practical, merciful in its way, but also an admission of failure that the Church could not minister in person, only by paper decree. You can almost hear the rasp of the quill scratching the words, the wax seal pressed hastily, while outside the streets groaned with the dying. The atmosphere of Rome during the plague was unbearable. Imagine the clanging of church bells ringing constantly, each toll marking another death. Smell the acrid smoke of hastily burned bodies, mingling with the sweetness of incense. Hear the silence of abandoned markets, the scurrying of rats over empty stalls. Faith itself seemed infected. People prayed desperately, yet priests died as quickly as their flocks. Many began to wonder if the Pope's flight proved God had abandoned them all. Interpretations differ. Some scholars argue the papacy's retreat was understandable after all. Survival of the institution required preserving its head. Others see cowardice, a betrayal of the shepherd's duty to remain among the suffering. Perhaps both are true. The debate echoes like the coughs of plague victims, unsettling, unresolved. A bitter anecdote circulates from Florentine satire. Poets mocked the papacy by imagining Saint Peter at heaven's gate refusing entry to popes who had fled the plague, saying, "You left your sheep, why should we let you in?" The line spread quickly, carried in laughter that barely masked despair. You can almost hear it whispered in Roman alleys, half joke, half judgment. Step into a plague-stricken home in your imagination. The air is sour, the shutters close tight. A mother rocks her fevered child, singing softly even as tears streak her face. Outside, footsteps retreat quickly, neighbors too afraid to enter. No priest knocks, no pope comes. The isolation is total. And yet, somewhere far away, the papal treasury fills as indulgences are still sold, the contradiction sharp enough to sting. Another odd note from Chronicles. Some claimed Clement VI grew so weary of plague burials that he consecrated the entire Rhone River as a graveyard, declaring anyone tossed into its waters was safely buried in holy ground. Whether legend or truth, the image is haunting. You can almost hear the splash of bodies, the murmur of water carrying the dead past silent villages. The sensory impressions are overwhelming. The heat of funeral pyres on your face, the acrid smoke choking your throat, the buzzing of flies thick in the air, the taste of stale bread in your mouth, rationed from dwindling supplies, the feel of rosary beads slipping in sweaty palms, prayers muttered faster than breath. Every sense screams of despair. Scholars continue to argue whether the plague permanently weakened the papacy. Some insist it exposed corruption and cowardice, eroding trust in Rome. Others claim it made the Church more flexible, forcing it to adapt with new decrees and broader notions of mercy. The truth is tangled, like the plague pits themselves, layers of bodies, layers of interpretation. As you leave this vision of plague, you pass a deserted chapel. The doors creak open, revealing rows of empty pews. Candles sputter, their wax melted into puddles. A crucifix hangs crooked on the wall. You step inside, your footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. For a moment you imagine the prayers that once filled this space, now replaced by the groan of wind through cracked windows. The scandal of the plague years was not only death but abandonment. The Pope, supposed to be father to all, retreated into fire-walled chambers or foreign palaces while the city he ruled turned to ash. And you, wandering through this memory, carry the uneasy weight of that absence. The silence of abandoned Rome clings to you as you drift onward, deeper into the labyrinth where even darker scandals await. The silence of plague-stricken Rome lingers in your ears, but now it is pierced by a sharper sound, the hiss of a blade drawn in secret, the whisper of conspirators in a garden at dusk. Tonight you enter the world of papal assassinations, plots and daggers hidden in cloisters, poisoned fruits exchanged for gifts, and rival families who believed that killing a pope was simply another form of politics. The historical record makes clear that popes were far from safe on their thrones. More than once, pontiffs were murdered outright or vanished under suspicious circumstances. The papacy, for all its claims of divine protection, remained vulnerable to human ambition. Imagine a pope kneeling in prayer one evening, his candle casting soft light, unaware that footsteps approach behind him. The scent of roses from the garden mingles with the metallic tang of steel. The Holy Father breathes a psalm, and in the next heartbeat a knife flashes. One well-attested case is the death of Pope John VIII in 882. Chroniclers wrote that he was poisoned, and when that failed, he was beaten to death with hammers. The brutality is shocking, but it reveals how fragile the papal office could be in turbulent times. You can almost hear the blows landing, the muffled cries, the hurried footsteps as conspirators fled into the dark Roman night. A peculiar anecdote clings to another episode. Pope Stephen IX was rumoured to have died suddenly in 1058, some whispering that he was poisoned during negotiations with rival factions. Later satirists claimed he had been served poisoned figs again, the fruit that so often appears in papal scandal. The image lingers, sweet flesh bursting on the tongue, followed by agony in the gut. Was it truth, or a rumour polished into legend? The ambiguity only adds to the unease. The atmosphere of such conspiracies is tense, almost theatrical. Picture the Vatican gardens at twilight. Cicadas hum, fountains trickle softly, and yet shadows move strangely among the hedges. A servant passes with a tray of wine, his hands shaking slightly. Two cardinals whisper in Latin, their faces pale. Everyone senses that death hovers nearby, though no one dares to speak it aloud. The very air tastes metallic, as if the garden itself knows what is about to unfold. Scholarly interpretations vary widely. Some historians argue many alleged papal murders were natural deaths, later spiced into legend by enemies. Others maintain that assassination was an all-too common reality in a city ruled by rival Roman families and foreign powers. Perhaps both views are true. Some popes died of sickness, others of daggers, and rumour blurred the line between them. What matters is perception. The faithful came to believe their shepherds were prey as often as they were protectors. One darkly comic story tells of a would-be assassin disguised as a monk who slipped into a papal audience carrying a dagger hidden in his prayer book. He was discovered when he opened the book upside down. The guards pounced, and the would-be killer was dragged away, protesting that the devil had turned his pages. Whether true or embroidered satire, the tale circulated widely, whispered with nervous laughter in Roman streets. You can almost hear the chuckle of market women, shaking their heads at the absurdity of a monk's dagger. The sensory weight of assassination rumours is heavy. Feel the cool stone of cloister walls beneath your hand as you creep through shadowed corridors. Hear the echo of soft sandals behind you, never certain if they belong to a servant or a killer. Smell the faint sweetness of roses masking the acrid tang of steel. Each sensation reminds you that power carried not only robes and rings, but also targets painted invisibly on the back of every pope. A chilling example often cited is Pope Benedict VI, strangled in 974 after being imprisoned by political rivals. The rope tightened around his throat, while chants for his successor already rose outside. Imagine the sound, the creak of rope, the rasp of breath, the silence that follows. In that silence, ambition celebrated its victory. And yet, assassinations did not always silence scandal, they often multiplied it. Rumors spread faster than truth. Some whispered that entire conclaves were manipulated by poison and murder, that the Holy Spirit was less decisive in papal elections than daggers in the dark. The image of assassins in gardens or poisoners at banquets fed the growing cynicism of Europe. One curious account comes from the death of Boniface VIII. Officially, he died in 1303 after humiliation at the hands of French forces, but rumors whispered he had been beaten savagely, even tortured, before his death. Whether natural or violent, his fate became emblematic. The Pope could be struck down like any baron, no divine shield protecting him. You can almost hear the gossip ripple through Europe, a collective gasp that Rome's shepherd was as mortal and vulnerable as his flock. The debate among modern scholars continues. Were these murders exaggerated slanders, penned by enemies eager to disgrace the papacy? Or were they honest chronicles of a dangerous time, when daggers ruled as often as decrees? The ambiguity itself is haunting, leaving you to imagine shadows shifting behind every papal throne. Step back now into an imagined papal chamber at night. The air is warm, the only sound, the faint scratching of quills in the scriptorium beyond. A pope kneels in prayer, his shadow stretched across the floor. Suddenly, the latch clicks, the door creaks. A figure slips inside, dagger glinting in torchlight. The prayer halts. The chamber holds its breath. In that moment you realize how fragile the tiara truly was. Not a crown of iron, but of paper, easily torn. As you drift onward, the echo of assassins lingers. You hear the rattle of chains, the whisper of conspirators in gardens, the wet cough of poisoned men. You carry with you the bitter truth that in medieval Rome, popes were not only rulers and shepherds, but also prey targets of ambition sharpened into blades. The whisper of daggers fades, but your steps carry you downward again, into tunnels carved beneath palaces and chapels. The air grows damp, smelling of earth and candle wax, and your hand brushes cold stone. Tonight you explore one of the stranger legacies of papal scandal, secret passages dug beneath the Vatican, built for escapes, ambushes, and some whispered, midnight rendezvous. It is a matter of record that certain popes commissioned fortified corridors. The most famous example is the Passetto di Borgo, a nearly 800-meter covered passage connecting the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo. Built in the 13th century and expanded by later popes, it was a lifeline when enemies stormed Rome. Yet the tunnels were not only for defense. Chronicles hint at other subterranean paths, some leading to gardens, monasteries, or even private houses. Officially, they were fortifications. Unofficially, they became arteries of intrigue. Picture yourself stepping inside. The passage is narrow, the ceiling low. A torch sputters, its smoke curling upward, staining the stone. The air is cool and close, with a faint mineral tang, like rain on limestone. Your footsteps echo hollowly. Along the walls, scratch marks from tools remain, testimony to labor done in secrecy. You hear faint drips of water, the rustle of rats. It feels less like a holy city and more like a thief's den. One well-recorded use of the Passetto came in 1527, when Pope Clement VII fled down its length to escape the brutal sack of Rome. Soldiers roared through the streets above, fire and screams filling the air, while beneath them the pontiff hurried in darkness, his robes brushing damp walls. Imagine the fear. Each echo of his footsteps felt like a signal to pursuers. each gust of wind a phantom hand on his shoulder. But older rumors reach back to the Middle Ages. Some whispered that certain tunnels connected directly to noble palaces, allowing clandestine visits at night. Whether true or slander, the thought is vivid. You can almost hear the soft tread of slippers on stone, the muffled laughter of companions slipping into shadow, the hurried closing of a secret door before dawn bells rang. A curious anecdote tells of a pope who supposedly had a trap door beneath his chamber, leading to a hidden corridor. Satirists joked that it was less for escape from enemies than for slipping out unseen when company called. Whether invention or not, the story took root, circulating in taverns as proof that even in matters of masonry, Rome's builders mixed prudence with pleasure. The atmosphere of these tunnels is ripe with contradiction. On one hand, they symbolize prudence, fortifications to protect God's vicar. On the other, they invite suspicion. Why does a shepherd of souls need secret doors? You stand there in imagination, the torchlight flickering, feeling the walls pressing close, and you sense both safety and guilt woven into the very stone. Scholars remain divided. Some emphasize the military necessity. Rome was turbulent, and without secret routes the papacy would have fallen more than once. Others argue that later gossip about midnight trysts or conspiracies sprang from the secrecy itself. When corridors are hidden, rumor fills the void. The truth, like the tunnels, remains partly buried. One peculiar, even comic, story survives from the 15th century. During repairs, workers supposedly discovered a passage blocked for decades. When opened, it revealed not treasure or relics, but a pile of empty wine jugs. The rumor spread that it had been a pope's private route to a vintner's cellar. Rome laughed for weeks, children chanting, "The Holy Father's holy thirst." You can almost hear the giggles echoing through alleyways, as satire turned masonry into mockery. The sensory experience is stark. Touch the rough walls, damp beneath your fingertips. Hear your own breath echo back at you, magnified by stone. Smell the mix of mold, dust, and faint smoke from torches. Feel the unease of darkness stretching ahead. Each turn a mystery. These were not corridors of prayer, but of survival, their silence heavier than hymns. Another vivid account tells how Pope Alexander VI used tunnels to move discreetly between palaces, accompanied by guards carrying lanterns. Some whispered the routes led to meetings with mistresses. Others said they were simply practical shortcuts. The ambiguity is tantalizing, and in your mind's ear you hear the guard's boots striking stone, the Pope's voice low, the lanterns swinging shadows against the walls. And always, above ground, Rome bustled with prayers, bells, and processions, while beneath secrets slipped silently through the earth. That duality defines the scandal. A church proclaiming transparency and truth, yet sheltering in darkness when expedient. Experts continue to debate whether these tunnels were more symbolic than practical. Were they defenses against external foes, or confessions of internal fear? Did they protect the papacy, or betray its paranoia? The questions remain open, like a door half hidden in the stone, daring you to wonder what lies beyond. Step out at last into the courtyard of Castel Sant'Angelo. The night air is fresh after the damp tunnels. The stars glitter faintly above. You glance back at the passageway, its mouth yawning like the throat of some beast. You carry with you the memory of its silence, its damp breath, and the uneasy truth that even popes walked more comfortably in shadows than in light. As you drift onward, the echo of your footsteps fades into memory. The tunnels remain behind you, a subterranean metaphor, escape routes, carved not only through earth, but through the uneasy conscience of the papacy itself. The damp chill of tunnels fades, but as you rise into the daylight of another papal court, you hear a different sound. Entirely the crisp clink of rings tapped against goblets, the shuffle of ledgers, the whispered dealings of bankers. Tonight you step into the scandal of moneylenders tied to the papacy, a web of finances that stretched across Europe and bound kings with invisible cords of debt. The well-documented fact is that the papacy was not only a spiritual empire but a financial one. From the 12th century onward, Popes relied heavily on Italian banking families, the Caetani, the Colonna, the Medici, and others whose fortunes were built not on prayer but on lending. Officially, the Church condemned usury, calling interest sinful. Yet in practice, the Vatican partnered with bankers, and popes themselves sometimes functioned like financiers, manipulating loans, taxes, and debts to control princes. The hypocrisy is so sharp you can almost taste it. Picture the setting: a dim chamber in the Lateran, lit by narrow windows. The air smells of wax, ink, and dust from heavy ledgers. A banker in a fine cloak bows low, then spreads parchment across the table. His fingers glitter with rings, each gem catching the candlelight. The Pope listens intently, nodding, his hand resting not on a Bible but on a tally stick marking debts owed by monarchs. Outside, peasants kneel in prayer. Inside, the salvation of kingdoms is negotiated in columns of numbers. One curious example stands out. Pope Boniface VIII was accused by critics of enriching his family through banking ventures, intertwining the papal treasury with private coffers. Whether exaggerated or not, the perception was enough to stain his reputation. Enemies mocked him as the banker in white, a nickname that clung like smoke. You can almost hear the sarcasm in Roman taverns. Men raising mugs of cheap wine and jeering, "Blessings for sale, credit with interest." Another vivid episode occurred in the 14th century, when Pope John XXIII relied on Florentine bankers to manage papal income. Chronicles tell of caravans carrying chests of coins southward, guarded by mercenaries, the sound of hooves thundering on cobblestones. Yet when those same banks collapsed in the 1342nd, kings and popes alike were left scrambling. The papacy's dependence on worldly financiers was laid bare, its holy image tarnished by unpaid bills. The atmosphere of such dealings is thick with contradiction. Imagine the Pope's chamber filled with the smell of ink and parchment, the rustle of parchment as contracts are signed, the scrape of quills across thick vellum. The words written there could topple monarchs or raise armies. You hear the sighs of kings across Europe, groaning under the weight of papal loans, yet unable to resist the leverage Rome wielded. One odd anecdote survives in satire. A pamphlet claimed that a pope once blessed a chest of gold before sending it on loan to a prince, declaring, "May God guard this treasure until it returns with children." The mocking phrase, "gold with children," became a popular joke, whispered to mean interest. Whether truth or parody, the humor cut deep, exposing the uneasy marriage between spirituality and finance. Scholars differ sharply in their interpretations. Some argue that papal banking was practical necessity, ruling the papal states, funding crusades, and supporting vast bureaucracies demanded reliable revenue. Others insist it was corruption, pure and simple hypocrisy dressed in Latin decrees, condemning usurers while secretly pocketing their profits. Perhaps the truth lies in both, survival and scandal bound together by coin. You step into a marketplace in Florence in your imagination. Merchants haggle, the air smells of wool and spices, and amid the bustle you hear mutters of papal debts. A banker leans on his stall, smirking, "The Pope himself owes me more than the king." The words ripple outward, half boast, half threat. The crowd laughs uneasily, for they know it may be true. A humorous yet biting song from Germany poked fun at Rome's financial dealings. Peter's pence buys not heaven, but palaces of stone. Sung by students, the verses mocked the idea that coins collected for devotion lined bankers' pockets. You can almost hear their voices echo in beer halls, the clink of mugs punctuating each bitter line. The sensory texture of papal finance is palpable. Feel the cool smoothness of gold coins slipping through your fingers, heavy and cold. Smell the musk of parchment stamped with seals, wax still warm. Hear the chests slam shut, the locks click, the muffled grunt of men carrying treasure down corridors. Salvation may have been the business of the church, but coin was its bloodstream, pumping through every vein of its empire. One last anecdote captures the cynicism of the age. It is said that when an indebted king once delayed payment, A papal envoy threatened him not with excommunication but with bankruptcy, sneering, "God forgives, but Rome collects." The line, whether invented or not, encapsulates the scandal perfectly. Forgiveness preached from pulpits, interest demanded from thrones. As you leave this chamber of ledgers and gold, the smell of ink still clings to you. You carry the realization that the papacy was never only a house of prayer but also a house of credit, its power secured as much by coin as by creed. The echo of coins rattling in locked chests follows you as you drift deeper into the labyrinth, uneasy at how tightly heaven was bound to debt. The echo of coins fades behind you, but now a new sound rises, hooves on cobblestones, drums rolling in rhythm, trumpets blaring as if to split the Roman sky. Tonight you witness papal pomp at its most extravagant. The coronation processions, those golden parades through the city when a newly elected pontiff donned the triple tiara. What was meant to embody divine majesty often tipped into scandalous excess, a spectacle more royal than spiritual, and one that left common folk shaking their heads. The fact is clear. Medieval papal coronations rivaled, and sometimes surpassed, imperial pageantry. Contemporary chronicles describe entire streets carpeted with flowers, fountains running with wine, and nobles dressed in silks of impossible brightness. Rome became a stage, and the Pope its actor king. Picture the Lateran Square at dawn, banners snapping in the breeze, the smell of fresh-cut roses thrown beneath gilded carriages, and crowds pressing shoulder to shoulder. Bells peal so loudly they seem to shake the very stones. One vivid record tells of Pope Innocent III's coronation in 1198. He processed through Rome with such grandeur that observers compared it to Caesar's triumphs. Mounted knights flanked him, their armor glittering like fire in the sun, while servants carried jeweled parasols above his head. You can almost hear the collective gasp of the crowd, the rustle of thousands bowing as he passed, and yet the unease simmered. Was this Christ's vicar or a Roman emperor reborn? A curious anecdote survives from a later coronation, when the Pope was seated on a special chair and handed a burning bundle of flax. A master of ceremonies intoned, "Thus passes the glory of the world." The Pope nodded gravely, but onlookers whispered that the ritual was hollow. After all, the same Pope then paraded with golden horses and banquets of roasted peacocks. You can almost smell the charred flax mingling with the heavy scent of perfumed oils, irony smouldering in the air. The atmosphere was overwhelming. Imagine standing in the crowd, the heat of bodies pressing close, the sharp odor of sweat mixed with incense wafting from censers, the clatter of horses' hooves striking stone. Trumpets blare so loudly your ears ring. Children wave branches, women chant prayers, men cheer with voices hoarse from shouting. And in the center, the new Pope rides beneath a canopy, every jewel on his vestments catching the sun. The spectacle dazzles your eyes but unsettles your heart. Interpretations of this grandeur remain divided. Some scholars see it as necessary theatre, a visual sermon that reminded the world of Rome's supremacy. Others condemn it as hypocrisy, excess incompatible with the humility preached from pulpits. The tension between spectacle and spirituality flickered like torchlight, never resolved. One odd detail from satire. Roman jokesters once claimed that the streets ran with wine, not by miracle, but because papal servants had accidentally smashed casks. Children supposedly scooped it up with cups, singing mock hymns to Bacchus rather than Christ. Whether apocryphal or not, the story reveals how ordinary people blurred reverence with ridicule. You can almost hear their drunken laughter echoing off marble walls. Step into a banquet following a coronation. Long tables stretch beneath vaulted ceilings, candles sputter, the smell of roasted boar fills the air. Cardinals clink goblets heavy with spiced wine, their laughter mingling with the drone of minstrels. Servants hurry with trays of sugared fruits, honey cakes, and bowls of almonds. The Pope himself raises a golden cup, his eyes shining, as courtiers cheer. The contradiction cuts deep. Humility preached in sermons, feasting practiced in halls. A biting rumor claims that during one coronation feast, a pontiff became so drunk he had to be carried from the hall, his tiara askew. Satirists quipped that Peter's keys were lost in a goblet. Whether true or slander, the line spread across Europe, a toast repeated with mocking laughter in taverns. The sensory flood of coronation pomp is inescapable. Feel the silk of banners brushing against your cheek as they wave overhead. Smell the mingling aromas of rose petals and horse dung on the cobblestones. Hear the clash of cymbals, the cries of heralds, the roar of the crowd swelling like a tide. Taste the sticky sweetness of candied figs passed from hand to hand, the metallic tang of coins tossed into the throng as gifts. Every sense is drenched in contradiction. Splendor meant to inspire awe, yet leaving behind the sour taste of excess. Experts continue to wrestle with the meaning of these ceremonies. Were they brilliant acts of political theatre, securing papal authority in a dangerous world? Or were they gaudy betrayals of Christ's call to humility, proof that the papacy had become indistinguishable from monarchy? The debate flickers endlessly, like the torches lining Rome's streets that day, each one burning bright and brief. As night falls in your imagination, you watch the last of the processions fade. The streets are littered with wilted flowers, broken goblets, and the sticky remnants of spilled wine. The crowd disperses, muttering mixed prayers and jokes. The Pope retires to gilded chambers, while beggars pick over scraps in the gutter. You breathe the cooling air, heavy with smoke from torches, and realize the coronation has left the city not uplifted, but exhausted. And so you walk onward, carrying the echo of trumpets in your ears, the shimmer of jewels in your eyes, and the bitter aftertaste of grandeur in your mouth. The scandal of coronations is not that they happened, but that they revealed so plainly the papacy's double face, shepherd of souls, yet emperor, in all but name. The trumpets of coronations fade, but what lingers is the sound of iron gates creaking and the shuffle of chains. Tonight you descend into the darker chambers of papal prisons, where heretics, rivals, and unlucky pawns of politics found themselves in cells that smelled more of mildew than mercy. The scandal is not only that such prisons existed, but that they were run by those who preached forgiveness. The historical record is clear enough. The papal states maintained dungeons, and inquisitors operated with papal authority. Prisoners were kept in Castel Sant'Angelo, in the dank cells beneath the Vatican, or in monasteries converted into holding pens. The irony presses in bishops spoke of the soul's freedom even as their walls echoed with the groans of captives. Picture Castel Sant'Angelo at dusk. The sky glows red as the Tiber flows dark and sluggish below. Torches flare on the battlements. Inside, the air is thick with dampness and the sharp tang of rusted iron. You walk through narrow corridors, hearing the rattle of keys and the muffled coughs of prisoners. The walls are slick with moisture. The smell of mold stings your nose. Down here, faith becomes chains, and silence speaks louder than sermons. One notorious episode involves Pope Innocent VIII, whose prisons overflowed with suspected heretics and political enemies. Chroniclers hint that conditions were appalling. Prisoners half-starved, their feet shackled to walls, their only company the scratching of rats. You can almost hear the drip of water from the ceiling, the scrape of chains as a prisoner shifts in the dark, whispering prayers no one will answer. A curious anecdote lingers about Pope Boniface VIII. Though remembered for arrogance and conflict, one satire accused him of keeping his critics in cells so narrow they could not stand upright. Whether true or exaggeration, the story struck a chord, and Roman street songs mocked him as the Pope who bent men to his will by bending their spines. You can almost hear the cruel laughter of children repeating the rhyme in alleys. The atmosphere of these prisons is suffocating. Touch the cold stone wall, slick with moss. Hear the distant clang of a door slamming shut. Smell straw rotting in corners, sharp with ammonia from years of neglect. The taste of stale water lingers on your tongue, sour and metallic. Every sense reminds you of despair. Interpretations of papal prisons remain divided. Some scholars argue they were no worse than secular dungeons of the era, harsh, but typical. Others point to evidence of cruelty, claiming the papacy used imprisonment as a weapon not only against heresy, but against political rivals. The truth likely lies in both. Punishment blended with politics, sanctity tangled with strategy. One odd, almost comic story survives. A prisoner is said to have carved mocking graffiti into the wall of his Vatican cell, sketching the Pope with donkey ears. When guards discovered it, they laughed so hard they left it in place. The scratchings, if real, were later erased, but the rumor persisted, whispered as proof that even chains could not silence satire. Step deeper into the cells. A torch flickers, casting grotesque shadows. You hear murmured voices, two prisoners, whispering through a crack in the stone. One asks whether God still listens in such a place. The other replies only with a weary laugh. Their words dissolve into coughs, echoing through the corridor. You realize how scandalous it is that the successors of Peter, once jailed by Rome for preaching faith, now oversaw prisons of their own. One striking case is that of Giordano da Pisa, a Dominican preacher later silenced for dissent. Though not executed in Rome, he spent years under papal suspicion, and rumors say he languished in papal custody before his final fate. Whether fact or slander, the association stuck, a reminder that imprisonment could shadow anyone who crossed Rome's path. The sensory images continue to weigh on you. The clink of a chalice carried down to prisoners for communion, the priest's voice echoing faintly as he mumbles prayers in a chamber heavy with despair. The faint glow of candlelight illuminating hollow faces, eyes wide with both hope and bitterness. The rasp of chains against stone as someone shifts in the straw. Some scholars argue that papal prisons reveal the papacy's humanity, flawed, fearful, and pragmatic. Others insist they expose hypocrisy at its rawest. Mercy preached from balconies while cruelty reigned in basements. You sense that both may be right, and the truth seeps like dampness into every crack of stone. One last anecdote surfaces from Roman gossip. It was said that when a pope died, prisoners banged on their cell doors until guards relented, believing that the change in leadership might bring them freedom. Sometimes they were right. Other times, only disappointment echoed back. You can almost hear the hollow banging, the desperate rhythm of men praying for release that never came. As you step out into the night air above, the stars seem colder, sharper. The prison's stink clings to your clothes, and you carry with you the uneasy knowledge that beneath gilded chapels lay darkness where prayers turn to sighs. The scandal of papal prisons is not only that they existed, but that they proved even shepherds could chain their sheep. The clank of iron gates fades behind you, but the sound that replaces it is softer, subtler, the shuffle of parchment, the scratching of quills, the low murmur of voices in chambers heavy with secrecy. Tonight you step into another scandal of the medieval papacy. Forged documents and false decrees, papers written to bend the past and justify the present. The scandal was not only that such forgeries existed, but that popes sometimes leaned upon them as though they were bedrock truth. The historical record is clear about one of the most infamous examples, the donation of Constantine. This document, supposedly from the 4th century Emperor Constantine, granted the Pope authority over Rome and the Western Empire. For centuries, it was cited as divine proof of papal supremacy. Only later was it exposed as an invention of the 8th century. Yet throughout the Middle Ages it was brandished like scripture, shaping battles, alliances, and crowns. Imagine popes raising the parchment aloft, their rings glinting, as kings bowed reluctantly before a lie written in ink. Step into a papal chamber in your imagination. The air smells of wax and vellum, heavy with the dust of centuries. A pope sits at a table, the donation unrolled before him. Its script gleams faintly in lamplight, each line proclaiming authority gifted by a saintly emperor. Around the table, cardinals nod solemnly, though some glance at one another with unease. Outside, the city teems with merchants, pilgrims, and beggars, unaware that their lives are being steered by a document born of forgery. One peculiar anecdote lingers. Enemies of the papacy sometimes joked that Constantine must have been drunk when he gave away half the empire. A German satirist quipped, "Only a man fevered with wine or madness could be so generous." The humour bit deep, circulating in taverns where mugs slammed on tables in ironic toasts. You can almost hear the laughter echo, coarse and bitter, as ordinary folk mocked the foundations of papal power. The atmosphere in papal scriptoria was electric with both sanctity and deceit. Imagine monks bent over desks, the smell of ink sharp in the air, their quills scratching steadily. Some copied scripture, others, whether knowingly or not, copied false charters and spurious decrees. The boundary between preservation and invention blurred like smoke. Was the forger a villain, or simply a craftsman doing his master's bidding? The question lingers, unanswered in the flickering torchlight. Historians continue to debate whether popes themselves believed in these documents or knowingly exploited them. Some argue that educated pontiffs must have recognized the anachronisms. Others suggest they convinced themselves of their truth, eager to anchor their authority. Perhaps both are true, and the power of belief was stronger than the suspicion of fraud. Another curious case is the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, forged in the 9th century but widely cited throughout the Middle Ages. These texts strengthened papal authority over bishops, granting Rome's supremacy in disputes. Imagine the scene. A bishop protests his independence, but the Pope unfurls a parchment, citing words that never belonged to early fathers. The bishop bows, silenced by a fiction. You almost hear the sighs of resignation, the shuffle of feet as power bends to paper. The sensory detail of these forgeries is vivid. Run your hand across vellum that feels smooth but stiff, its letters inked in dark brown. Smell the faint musk of animal skin, preserved for centuries. Hear the slow, steady scratch of quills, writing words with the weight of eternity. Each stroke of ink carries deception, yet to the eyes of the time, it gleamed with authority. One humorous story survives from satire. A lampoon depicted the Pope receiving a newly discovered decree that conveniently matched his latest policy, as if heaven itself were his secretary. Rome laughed, saying, "The archives of Peter expand as quickly as his desires." The jest stung because it rang so close to truth. Interpretations of these scandals are still contested. Some scholars argue the forgeries were less about conscious lies than about reflecting ideals, documents crafted to express what should be true, even if history had not supplied it. Others condemn them as deliberate frauds, power plays cloaked in ink. Either way, the effect was the same. Forged words bent crowns, silenced bishops, and reshaped Christendom. Step into an imagined council chamber. The air buzzes with debate, voices raised, robes rustling. A pope lifts a parchment, his voice steady as he reads. The bishops shift uneasily. Some frown, others bow their heads. The smell of sweat and candle smoke thickens. The words sound ancient, but a few hear their falseness like a discordant note. Yet no one dares speak. Silence once more does the work of complicity. One final anecdote lingers from centuries later, when Lorenzo Valla, a humanist scholar, proved the donation of Constantine a forgery. His analysis of language and style shattered the illusion. Imagine the gasp of realization, the ink of centuries unraveling under scrutiny. Though Valla lived after the medieval height of papal power, his discovery confirmed what many had long suspected, that the very stones of Rome's authority rested on cracked foundations. You can almost hear the nervous laughter of students as they read his work, whispering, "So the emperor never gave it. Rome simply took it." As you step away from these chambers of ink and deceit, the smell of parchment clings to you, dry and faintly sour. You carry the unsettling truth that popes, while condemning lies, often stood upon them. The scandal of forged decrees is not only that they existed, but that they ruled nations as surely as swords. The rustle of forged parchments fades, but the echo of their authority lingers like smoke. Now the air shifts again, warmer, scented not with wax but with perfume, musk, and the faint sweetness of violets drifting from palace gardens. Tonight you step into the scandal of papal mistresses and secret romances, the women who, despite vows of celibacy, walked openly or secretly through the lives of medieval popes. The scandal is not only that these liaisons existed, but that they were woven into the fabric of papal courts, creating dynasties of illegitimate children and whispered intrigues. The historical fact is unavoidable. Multiple popes fathered children while in office. Some acknowledged them openly, others pretended innocence while arranging advantageous marriages for their nieces and nephews. Chroniclers record how rumors of papal lovers buzzed through Rome like flies on honey. You can almost hear the laughter of tavern crowds, the half-serious chants of pilgrims, the nervous coughs of clergy trying to explain away the obvious. Picture an evening chamber in the Lateran Palace. The lamps burn low, casting golden halos on crimson drapery. The air smells of spiced wine and roses. A pope reclines in a carved chair, his white robes loosened at the collar. Across from him, a woman leans close, her voice soft, her eyes shining in lamplight. Servants shuffle quietly outside, pretending not to hear the laughter spilling from within. The scene is intimate, but also political, for every whisper carries consequences in the labyrinth of Rome. One firmly attested case is Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Rodrigo Borgia. His love affairs were so public that even his enemies stopped pretending scandal, they simply treated them as fact. His long liaison with Vanozza dei Catanei produced 4 children, among them Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, who themselves became infamous figures in European politics. You can almost hear the bustle of their household, the clatter of dishes, the shouts of children in corridors, the laughter of Vanozza hosting guests. This was no hidden sin but a papal family life, scandalously visible to the world. A curious anecdote survives about Pope Innocent VIII. He openly acknowledged numerous children, and one biting satire claimed his palace was more nursery than monastery. A lampooning verse sung in Roman streets joked, "The Pope baptizes not nations but sons." You can hear the coarse laughter of butchers and bakers as they passed the rhyme along, mockery disguised as song. The sensory atmosphere of papal romance is vivid. Imagine the scent of perfume wafting through gardens, mingling with the fragrance of orange blossoms. Hear the soft rustle of silken gowns in hallways at midnight, the faint click of slippers on marble. Feel the warm touch of candlelit air as secret meetings unfolded. For Rome's citizens, these details were not secret. They were gossip, painted in every mural of rumor across the city's walls. Interpretations of these affairs differ sharply. Some historians insist they were mere human failings, no worse than the sins of nobles or kings. Others see them as corrosive betrayals of vows, proof that papal celibacy was a brittle fiction. Both perspectives echo in the sources, and both still trouble the conscience of those who imagine the Pope as shepherd first and man second. A peculiar, almost comic, tale clings to the reign of Pope Julius II. Though primarily remembered as a warrior pope and patron of Michelangelo, he was also whispered to have fathered daughters. When one noble asked how many nieces Julius had, a satirist replied, "More than St. Anne had grandchildren." The biting quip spread quickly, turning court gossip into public ridicule. The atmosphere in Rome during these scandals was electric. Picture a noblewoman stepping from a carriage at dusk, her gown embroidered with jewels. Citizens glance at her, then glance knowingly at one another. She is rumored to be the Pope's mistress. Whispers follow her footsteps, mingling with the cries of street vendors. The air tastes of roasted chestnuts, but beneath the sweetness lies the acrid tang of scandal. One striking case involved Pope Paul III, who elevated 2 of his teenage grandsons to cardinalates. Everyone in Rome knew they were born of forbidden liaisons, and resentment flared. Yet Paul smiled calmly, blessing his family as though blessing the church itself. You can almost hear the murmurs of cardinals grinding their teeth, powerless against the nepotism born of bedroom secrets. And not all liaisons were whispers of romance. Some were political tools. Mistresses were used to forge alliances, to soften rival families, to provide leverage in power struggles. A pope's lover could be as dangerous or as useful as any cardinal. In the scent of roses lay the stench of politics. The sensory details deepen. In a Vatican chamber, a woman's laughter rings like a bell, echoing faintly down marble corridors. A servant coughs politely outside the door, pretending not to notice. In gardens, footsteps crunch gravel under moonlight, silk rustles, and the night air hums with crickets. The touch of warm air carries the weight of secrets shared too freely. Scholars remain divided. Were these scandals exaggerated by enemies eager to discredit Rome? Or were they plain truths, paraded openly by pontiffs who no longer cared for pretense? The debate endures, a reminder that rumor and reality often intertwine so closely in papal history that one cannot be separated from the other. One final anecdote whispers from the past. A Roman pamphlet mocked the papacy by comparing the tiara to a bridal veil. The Pope, it sneered, is married not to the church, but to whichever lady enters his chamber tonight. You can almost hear the roar of laughter from the crowd as the words were read aloud, their bitterness hidden inside humor. As you step away from these perfumed corridors, the scent of roses clings to your imagination. You carry with you the uneasy realization that even in the holiest of offices, desire walked boldly, trailing scandal behind it. The papacy preached celibacy, but in Rome's gardens and palaces, silk whispered otherwise. The perfume of papal mistresses lingers faintly in your mind, but as you walk further into the labyrinth, you hear a louder, heavier sound, hammers striking stone, scaffolds creaking, chisels scraping marble. Tonight you step into the scandal of monumental building projects, when popes spent fortunes on cathedrals and palaces so vast that Rome groaned under their weight. What should have been monuments to God often became monuments to vanity, leaving both awe and resentment in their wake. The fact is undeniable. Medieval and Renaissance popes poured colossal sums into construction. Basilicas, fortresses, palaces, aqueducts, each carried the stamp of a pontiff eager to carve his name into eternity. The Lateran was rebuilt, St. Peter's expanded, Castel Sant'Angelo fortified. Yet these projects were funded not from heavenly coffers, but from taxes, indulgences, and tithes wrung from the faithful. The contradiction is stark. Imagine peasants starving in villages while masons in Rome hoisted blocks of travertine to build yet another hall of marble. Picture a day at one of these sites. The sun beats down, dust rising, as oxen drag massive stones. The air rings with the clang of hammers and the shouts of foremen. The smell of lime mortar stings your nostrils, mingling with sweat and dust. Scaffolds groan as men climb higher, balancing chisels, ropes, and buckets. At the edge of the site, a pope arrives on horseback, robes flowing, his hand raised in blessing. Workers bow, though in their hearts they mutter that their backs break not for Christ, but for papal ambition. One striking example is the rebuilding of old St. Peter's Basilica. Long before the Renaissance dome of Michelangelo, popes dreamed of a sanctuary more splendid than any temple of antiquity. Medieval pontiffs began expansions, each adding chapels, cloisters, or altars, until the basilica became a patchwork of egos. You can almost hear the echo of chisels in the nave, the smell of sawdust and incense colliding in the half-finished halls. A peculiar anecdote survives about Pope Nicholas III in the late 13th century. Chronicles accuse him of diverting church funds to build a fortress for his family, the Orsini. Locals whispered that the walls bore his name carved more boldly than Christ's. One satirist joked that Nicholas had turned the keys of Peter into brick and mortar. You can almost hear the laughter echo in taverns, the clink of mugs punctuating each bitter line. The atmosphere of these building sites is overwhelming. Dust settles on your skin, grit crunches beneath your teeth. The din of tools never ceases, hammer on stone, saw on wood, voices raised in command. Water splashes from barrels onto thirsty workers, mixing with lime dust to sting their eyes. You feel both awe at the scale and anger at the cost. Interpretations differ sharply. Some historians argue these projects preserved Rome, creating beauty that still stands as testimony to human devotion. Others condemn them as vanity projects, draining the poor to fuel papal pride. The truth lies uneasily between magnificent monuments born of sacrifice, both holy and bitter. One humorous story clings to papal building fever. It was said a mason once carved his own face into a gargoyle, mocking the Pope by giving it donkey ears. When questioned, he swore it was a symbol of humility. The tale may be apocryphal, but you can almost hear the chuckles of workers passing beneath the stone face, their laughter rising, even as dust stung their throats. Step into the Vatican treasury, where coins clink as chests are hauled in. The smell of iron and old leather fills the room. Clerks bend over ledgers, tallying how many florins must be sent to stonecutters, carpenters, glassmakers. Outside, peasants murmur that their coins build palaces they will never see. Each page of those ledgers carries the weight of resentment as heavy as the stones piled in Rome. Another vivid episode centers on the papal palaces of Avignon. Even after the papacy returned to Rome, stories of those sumptuous halls painted with frescoes, decorated with gilded ceilings, stirred outrage. Critics called them castles of Babylon. You can almost hear Petrarch's scornful words, dripping with bitterness as he described the papal court drowning in luxury. The sensory flood is relentless. The hiss of wet plaster being smoothed, the sweet smell of pigments ground for frescoes, the rumble of carts carrying marble through narrow streets. The clang of bells interrupts, but even their holy sound is drowned by the hammering of laborers. The city itself becomes an orchestra of ambition, its soundtrack built on toil and complaint. Scholars still wrestle with the legacy. Were these monuments symbols of enduring faith, or scandals carved in stone? Some argue that even if born of pride, they inspire devotion centuries later. Others insist they stand as silent accusations, reminders of a church that prized grandeur above compassion. One final anecdote drifts from Roman lore. A beggar, staring at a new papal palace, supposedly muttered, "Better to build homes for the poor than palaces for princes." His words, overheard, spread through the streets, a refrain repeated quietly by peasants as they trudged past the shining walls. You can almost hear his mutter echo still, low and stubborn, against the grandeur towering above him. As you step away from the building sites, dust clings to your skin and the clang of hammers echoes in your ears. You carry with you the uneasy truth that even the most beautiful chapels and basilicas were born of sweat, taxes, and scandal. The monuments remain, dazzling in sunlight, but the whispers of resentment linger like dust that never fully settles. The hammering of masons drifts away, but what rises now is the clink of cups, the strum of lutes, and the laughter of courtiers echoing through candlelit halls. Tonight you step into the scandal of papal banquets, lavish feasts so extravagant they bordered on parody, where the successors of Peter reclined not as shepherds but as kings of indulgence. The scandal was not only the scale of the feasting, but the contrast. Peasants starved beyond Rome's walls while popes gorged in palaces fragrant with roasted meats and wine. The historical fact is undeniable. Medieval papal courts were notorious for their banquets. Chronicles describe tables laden with venison, pheasant, trout, honey cakes, sugared almonds, and rivers of wine. Etiquette books for cardinals even included instructions on how to serve popes, delicacies, quail stuffed with herbs, peacocks roasted with their feathers reattached, gilded pies that released doves when cut open. These were meals designed not only for sustenance but for theatre, displays of wealth disguised as devotion. Picture the Lateran Palace on such an evening. Torches blaze, filling the air with resinous smoke. Long tables stretch beneath vaulted ceilings, covered in white cloth embroidered with gold thread. The scent of cinnamon and cloves drifts through the hall, mingling with roasting meats and the sharp tang of wine. Courtiers in silks murmur, their rings clinking against goblets. At the head table, the Pope himself lifts a jeweled chalice, smiling as musicians strike their lutes. The sound of laughter swells louder than any hymn. One well-attested episode comes from Pope Martin IV in the 13th century, whose love for eels cooked in wine sauce became infamous. Chroniclers noted he ate them so often that Rome joked the Tiber must have run dry of fish. Eventually, legend claimed he died after eating a dish too rich, his indulgence quite literally consuming him. You can almost smell the oily, spiced steam rising from the platter, hear the scrape of forks against silver, sense the murmurs of guests too polite to remark on his gluttony. A curious anecdote lingers about Pope Clement VI during the Avignon papacy. Chronicles say his feasts were so extravagant that whole herds of cattle were slaughtered daily, their meat roasted for endless banquets. One satirist quipped that Clement ruled not a church but a kitchen. The barb circulated widely, and you can almost hear the laughter of peasants repeating it with bitter amusement as they gnawed crusts of stale bread. The sensory world of these banquets overwhelms you. Smell roasted boar, dripping fat onto open flames. Hear the crackle of fire, the squeal of spits turning. Feel the heat of hundreds of candles, the grease of meat coating your fingers, the sticky sweetness of sugared fruits on your tongue. Music swells, viols and lutes harmonizing, while jesters tumble and courtiers whisper. Every sense is drenched in excess. Interpretations of this feasting vary. Some historians argue the banquets reflected medieval norms of hospitality. Popes were expected to host kings, envoys, and pilgrims with splendor. Others condemn them as hypocrisy incarnate, symbols of greed out of step with Christ's poverty. Both readings shimmer in the sources, each guest at those tables seeing the same feast through different eyes. One humorous yet biting tale survives. A poet described a banquet where a roasted peacock was carried in with its feathers painted gold. As the bird was sliced, a child recited verses praising papal humility. The irony was so sharp the guests nearly choked, suppressing laughter. You can almost hear the coughs and giggles echoing through the hall, quickly masked by polite applause. The atmosphere outside such feasts was equally charged. Pilgrims crowded at the palace gates, smelling the rich aromas drifting from windows, their stomachs growling. Some begged scraps, and occasionally servants tossed them bones or crusts. Imagine their hands scrambling in the dust, fighting over morsels discarded from golden tables. The contrast is unbearable. Hunger in shadows, indulgence in torchlight. One striking rumor swirled around Pope Paul II in the 15th century. Though remembered more for the Renaissance, stories claimed he hosted masquerade feasts where guests wore elaborate costumes. Chroniclers accused him of turning papal banquets into carnivals, laughter and wine drowning out prayer. Was it truth or exaggeration? Perhaps both. The rumor spread because it rang plausible. Rome had seen too many feasts to dismiss the charge outright. The sensory contradictions deepen. Taste the sweetness of candied oranges, while outside, peasants taste only the bitterness of hunger. Here the polished jokes of courtiers echo off marble, while beyond the gates, you hear the muttered curses of the poor. Feel the soft velvet of cushions in the banqueting hall, while beggars sleep on stone steps in the cold. Every contrast gnaws at you. Scholars continue to argue whether these banquets should be read as mere cultural norms or as damning evidence of papal corruption. Were they symbols of generosity, feeding entire courts, or of selfishness, mocking Christ's command of simplicity? The question hangs heavy, like the smell of roasting meat that clings even after the fire dies. One final anecdote whispers through satire. A Roman wag declared that if Christ himself returned, he would have to enter the papal court disguised as a cook to gain admission. The line struck so hard it became a refrain in street songs, laughter echoing beneath the very walls of the Vatican. You can almost hear it, rough voices carrying the tune, a chorus of mockery blending with the clatter of empty bowls. As the banquet ends in your imagination, the tables are cleared, scraps swept into baskets, candles snuffed one by one. The hall grows silent, but the scent of grease and spice lingers stubbornly, soaked into stone. Servants mutter as they carry trays through darkened corridors, while outside the gates, beggars curl into themselves, waiting for dawn. And you step away, heavy with the memory of feasting, carrying the uncomfortable truth that even as the papacy spoke of fasting and humility, its halls shook with laughter, music, and the clink of goblets. The scandal of papal banquets was not only what they consumed, but what they revealed. A church that claimed the bread of heaven yet hoarded the fat of earth. The clatter of goblets fades, but now your footsteps echo in a quieter hall. The air is cooler here, tinged not with spices or wine, but with the faint scent of wax and damp stone. Tonight you enter the final scandal of this long journey, the sale of holy offices themselves. Simony, the buying and selling of spiritual power, was perhaps the most corrosive of all papal secrets, turning the sacraments into coin and reducing the very keys of heaven to merchandise. The fact is undeniable. Throughout the Middle Ages, popes were accused of granting bishoprics, abbeys, and even cardinals' hats in exchange for gold. Sometimes the transactions were cloaked in the language of gifts or tributes, but everyone understood the truth. Influence was not earned through holiness, but purchased like cloth in a market stall. You can almost hear the mutters of pilgrims in Roman taverns, voices sour with cynicism. Pay Peter, and you wear scarlet. Picture a papal chamber at dusk. The lamps glow faintly, smoke curling upward into shadowed rafters. A noble kneels before the Pope, not with prayers, but with a chest of coin. The clink of metal fills the silence as the lid is lifted. The Pope's fingers brush the gold, and a parchment is unrolled, naming the noble's son bishop of some distant see. The scent of coin mingles with the wax of candles, and you feel the scandal thick as incense. One notorious example is the papacy of Benedict IX in the 11th century, who, according to chroniclers, literally sold the papacy itself. Resigning for money, he passed the throne of Peter to his godfather, only to return later and reclaim it. You can almost hear the disbelief in Rome's streets, the cries of mockery. The papacy for sale. Who bids highest? His reign remains one of the darkest stains, proof that even the supreme office could be bartered like livestock. A peculiar anecdote survives about Pope John XIX in the early 11th century, accused of accepting bribes to recognize claims of patriarchs and princes. Some satirists joked that his papal title should be mercator, merchant, rather than pontifex, pontiff. The pun spread, repeated in marketplaces where hawkers called, "Buy fish, buy cloth, buy blessings." The laughter was sharp, but bitter, the humor born of disillusion. The atmosphere of simony is heavy with hypocrisy. Imagine standing in a cathedral where a newly appointed bishop celebrates his first mass. The air is thick with incense, the chant of choirs soars upward. Yet among the faithful, whispers circulate, "He bought that mitre." The chant falters in your ears, the sanctity hollowed by suspicion. You taste the metallic tang of coin even as the Eucharist is lifted high. Historians still debate the extent. Some argue simony was exaggerated by critics and reformers eager to shame Rome. Others insist it was pervasive, corroding the church from within for centuries. The truth likely lies in the uneasy middle. Abuses existed, too frequent to ignore, yet their memory was sharpened by the anger of those who suffered beneath them. One curious story tells of a French bishop who paid so dearly for his seat that when asked why he preached so rarely, he replied, "I spent my words in purchase." Whether invention or not, the jest reveals how deeply cynicism had taken root. You can almost hear the chuckle of townsfolk repeating it, shaking their heads at the state of the church. The sensory texture of simony is subtle but corrosive. Hear the whisper of coins spilling onto tables in candlelit rooms. Smell the damp wool of cloaks as envoys slip through palace doors at night. Feel the chill of parchment under your fingertips, its words granting power not through calling but through purchase. Every detail reminds you that sacred offices had become commodities. One final episode underscores the scandal. In the 15th century, Pope Sixtus IV openly appointed nephews and relatives to cardinalates, a form of nepotism barely distinguished from simony. Romans joked that scarlet was stitched by family purse strings. The mockery was sharp, and you can almost hear the grumbling of cardinals passed over, their teeth grinding as the Pope's kin donned crimson robes. Interpretations of simony remain divided. Was it simple corruption, or was it woven into the practical machinery of governance? Some argue it kept the church solvent, ensuring loyalty through investment. Others claim it gutted moral authority, sowing seeds of reform and rebellion. Both readings shimmer like candlelight, impossible to disentangle completely. Step into a quiet Roman street after one such appointment. The palace windows glow with feasting, laughter spilling into the night. But outside, beggars curl in doorways, their bowls empty. A pilgrim mutters. The shepherd sells his crook. His words hang heavy in the cool air, echoed by the shuffle of feet. You can almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down, the tension between gold and grace. And now, as this long journey reaches its end, you step back from the labyrinth of scandal. You have walked among corpses on trial, mistresses in gardens, alchemists in cellars, bankers in chambers, soldiers on battlefields, and banqueters in gilded halls. You have smelled incense mixed with rot, tasted coin alongside sacrament, heard laughter tangled with prayers. The papacy, clothed in sanctity, has revealed its humanity brilliant and broken, holy and scandalous. The journey softens now. The clang of coins, the cries of crowds, the groans of prisoners all grow faint, like echoes swallowed by distance. The scandals you've traced no longer press so sharply. They blur into memory, leaving only a gentle murmur in the night. You lie back, eyes closed, imagining Rome not as a city of corruption but as a mosaic of light and shadow, each piece imperfect, yet together forming a story both troubling and beautiful. Breathe slowly. Imagine the Tiber flowing steady, carrying away whispers of poison and gold, leaving ripples that gleam silver beneath the moon. Picture the basilicas standing tall, their stones silent now, but still warmed by centuries of sunlight. Hear the faint toll of bells, not mocking, not triumphant, just steady, like a heartbeat guiding you into calm. The scandals remind you that even the highest office was held by human hands flawed, frail, yearning, often foolish. Yet history itself endures, and so does the quiet comfort of knowing that truth survives, however tangled its path. In the end, you are left not with outrage, but with a kind of peace, a recognition that the past is both warning and reassurance. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the bells. Let the images fade, the feasts, the dungeons, the jewels, the parchments, all dissolve into stillness, leaving only the hush of night and the softness of your pillow. The story has unfolded, the voices have quieted, and now there is only rest. So close your eyes, let the weight slip from your shoulders, and drift into sleep. History will wait for you tomorrow. For now, let the scandals of popes become distant whispers, fading into the silence of dreams.